Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The wind swept across US 163's asphalt as Monument Valley's massive mesa silhouettes rose like ghosts in the moonlight. Officer Talon Bahe sat behind the wheel, watching sand clouds spiral in his headlight beams. Night patrol usually passed quietly, an occasional tourist vehicle, sometimes a local pickup moving too fast. But tonight felt different. The wind had been building for hours, and there was an electric charge in the air, a sense of waiting. Talon turned up his radio volume slightly, listening to dispatcher Iona Key's monotone voice. It would be another quiet night, or so he hoped. At 23:47, the radio crackled. Unit 12, this is dispatch. We're getting a report of a missing trucker on US 163. Near mile marker 15, close to Oljato Junction. Semi-truck, lost contact with driver. Can you check it out? Talon reached for the microphone. 10-4, dispatch, heading that way. ETA 15 minutes. Iona's voice came back, slightly more tense this time. Unit 12, be careful. Caller says the rig looks abandoned. Engines running, lights on but no driver. Storm's getting worse. Talon pressed the accelerator a bit harder. Sand humps danced across the road ahead. 15 minutes later, his headlights caught something in the darkness. A big rig on the shoulder, pulled over in the emergency lane. Red trailer, white cab. The engine really was running, light exhaust smoke drifting from the stack. Talon parked his unit behind the truck, flipped on his spotlight and swept the cab. Nobody inside. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, Unit 12. I've got the vehicle. Confirming, it appears abandoned, moving in to investigate. Talon stepped out of his door, and the wind nearly tore his jacket off his back. Sand filled his eyes and mouth. He clicked on his flashlight and started walking around the rig. The cab door wasn't locked. When he looked inside, the dashboard was still lit. The CB radio on, but no sound coming through, just static. On the seat was a thermos, a half-eaten sandwich, and a logbook. Talon picked up the logbook and flipped through the pages. The last entry was from today at 21:30. Driver's name, Ephraim Pike. Young guy from the photo clipped to the sun visor, maybe late 20s, dark hair, tired smile. Talon stepped back down from the cab and walked around to the trailer. It was a standard dry van, doors secured with a padlock and company seal intact. Nothing suspicious there. He circled back to the front of the truck, shining his light on the ground. That's when he noticed the tire tracks, fresh ones, leading off the shoulder and into the scrubland. They headed south, away from the highway toward the dry wash that ran parallel to the road about 50 yards out. Talon keyed his radio again. Dispatch, I've got tracks leading off-road. Looks like someone drove out into the wash. Requesting backup before I follow them. Iona's response was immediate. Copy that, Unit 12. Sergeant Begay is en route from Kayenta. ETA 20 minutes. Stay with the vehicle until he arrives. Talon acknowledged and walked back to his unit. He sat in the driver's seat, engine running, heater on full blast to fight the cold that had settled into his bones. The wind howled outside, rocking the vehicle slightly. He stared at the abandoned rig in his spotlight beam, watching shadows move across its surface. Something about this didn't sit right. A driver doesn't just abandon a running truck in the middle of nowhere. not unless something scared them off or pulled them away. 23 minutes later, Sergeant Marvin Begay's unit pulled up behind Talon's, lights flashing red and blue across the desert landscape. Marvin was in his mid-40s, stocky build, with deep-set eyes that had seen too much in his years on the force. He stepped out of his vehicle and walked up to Talon's window. "What have we got?" Talon gestured toward the rig. "Driver's name is Ephraim Pike. Last logbook entry was 21:30, about 2 hours ago. Truck's running, doors unlocked, personal items still inside. Tire tracks lead off into the wash. No sign of the driver." Marvin studied the scene for a moment, then nodded. "Let's take a look at those tracks. Stay close and keep your radio on." The two officers grabbed their flashlights and started following the tire tracks into the desert. The wind was brutal now, whipping sand into their faces and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The tracks were clear at first, deep impressions in the soft sand, but as they got closer to the wash, they started to get weird. The spacing changed, like the vehicle had been swerving. Then, about 30 yards from the highway, the tracks just stopped. Talon crouched down, shining his light on the ground. "Marvin, look at this." The tire impressions ended abruptly, as if the vehicle had simply vanished into thin air. There were no other tracks leading away, no signs of anyone walking, no disturbance in the sand beyond this point. Marvin walked in a wide circle around the area, searching for any continuation of the trail, but found nothing. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Vehicle doesn't just disappear." Talon stood up, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Maybe it turned around, went back to the highway. They walked back toward US 163, checking for any return tracks, but there was nothing. The tire impressions led one way, into the desert, and then vanished. Back at the highway, Marvin radioed dispatch for a tow truck and a crime scene unit. "We need to impound this rig and check it thoroughly. Something's not right here." As they waited, Talon walked back to the cab and climbed inside again. He picked up the CB radio microphone and pressed the transmit button. "Hello? This is Navajo Tribal Police. If anyone can hear this, please respond." Static. He tried again. "Ephraim Pike, if you're out there, please respond." More static. Then, faintly, underneath the white noise, something else. A voice? No, not quite. More like a pattern in the static, rising and falling. Talon turned up the volume and listened closely. It almost sounded like words, but distorted, stretched out. And then it repeated. The exact same pattern, the exact same cadence, over and over. Talon felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He released the transmit button and the sound stopped. He keyed it again, and the pattern returned, identical to before. He called Marvin over. "Listen to this." Marvin climbed into the cab and listened to the CB. His expression darkened. "That's not normal interference." Talon shook his head. "It's like it's stuck in a loop. Same thing over and over." Marvin reached down and turned off the CB radio. The cab fell silent except for the wind buffeting the truck. "Let's get out of here. Crime scene can deal with this." By the time the tow truck arrived, it was past 1 in the morning. The driver, a local named Holt Murdoch, looked at the rig and whistled. "Nice truck. Shame to see it abandoned like this." He hooked up the tow cables and started winching the semi onto his flatbed. Talon and Marvin stood by their vehicles, watching. As the truck was being loaded, Talon noticed something he'd missed before. On the driver's side door, barely visible in the dim light, were scratches. Deep ones, like someone had clawed at the metal. He pointed them out to Marvin. "Those look fresh." Marvin examined them with his flashlight. "Yeah, and they're on the outside of the door. Like someone was trying to get in, or something." They decided to follow the tow truck back to the impound yard in Kayenta. The drive took 40 minutes, and by the time they arrived, the wind had died down to a low moan. The yard was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, and a single floodlight illuminated the entrance. Holt parked the rig in the back corner of the lot and unhooked it. "She's all yours, officers. Need anything else?" Marvin shook his head. "We're good, thanks, Holt." The tow truck driver climbed back into his vehicle and drove off, leaving the two officers alone with the abandoned semi. Marvin pulled out a set of keys, master keys for common truck locks, and tried a few until one worked. The trailer doors swung open with a metallic groan. Inside was darkness. Talon shone his flashlight into the cargo area. Empty, completely empty. No freight, no pallets, nothing. Just bare metal walls and floor. "Pike was hauling air," Talon said. Marvin frowned. "Why would someone be driving an empty trailer out here in the middle of the night?" Talon didn't have an answer. They searched the trailer thoroughly, looking for any hidden compartments or contraband, but found nothing. The trailer was clean, almost too clean. No dust, no debris, like it had been scrubbed recently. They locked up the trailer and walked back to the cab. Marvin climbed in and started going through the logbook more carefully. "Pike's been driving this route for 3 weeks. Phoenix to Farmington and back, always the same route, always empty on the return trip." Talon leaned against the doorframe. "Human trafficking?" Marvin shrugged. "Possible. Empty trailers, a red flag. But if that's the case, where's the driver? And where are the people he was transporting?" Those questions hung in the cold, desert air, unanswered. At 2:30, they called it a night and agreed to meet back at the station in the morning. Talon drove home to his small house on the outskirts of Kayenta, exhausted but unable to shake the feeling that something was very wrong with this case. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle his windows. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those tire tracks disappearing into nothing. He saw the scratches on the truck door. He heard that looping pattern on the CB radio. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and filled with dreams of empty highways and endless darkness. The next morning, Talon arrived at the station at 7. Marvin was already there, looking like he hadn't slept either. "I've been thinking about this all night," Marvin said. "We need to find out more about Ephraim Pike. Check his background, talk to his employer, see if there's anything in his history that explains this." Talon nodded. "I'll start making calls." He spent the next 2 hours on the phone. Pike worked for a small trucking company out of Phoenix called Desert Haul. The dispatcher there, a woman named Linda, sounded genuinely worried when Talon explained the situation. "Ephraim's a good driver. Never missed a check-in. Never had any problems. This isn't like him at all." Talon asked about the empty trailer. Linda confirmed that Pike had been running return trips with no cargo. "It's cheaper for the client to have us bring the trailer back empty than to find freight going the opposite direction. Not unusual in this business." Talon asked if Pike had mentioned anything strange on his recent runs, any problems or concerns. Linda hesitated. "Actually, yeah. About a week ago, he called in and said he thought someone was following him on US 163. Late at night, same set of headlights staying behind him for miles. But when he pulled over to let them pass, they pulled over too. Then when he got back on the road, they followed again. He said it happened twice on the same run." Talon felt a chill run down his spine. "Did he file a report with anyone?" Linda said no. He thought maybe it was just his imagination, or another trucker messing with him, but he mentioned it to me because it freaked him out. Talon thanked her and hung up. He walked over to Marvin's desk and relayed the information. Marvin leaned back in his chair, thinking. So Pike thought he was being followed. Then he disappears. Could be related. Talon agreed. We should check traffic cameras, see if we can spot any vehicles following Pike on his last run. The problem was that US 163 through the Navajo Nation had very few traffic cameras. Most of the highway was remote, passing through open desert with limited infrastructure. The nearest camera was at the junction near Mexican Hat, about 40 miles north of where the truck was found. Marvin called the transportation department and requested footage from the previous night. An hour later, they had the video file. They watched it on Marvin's computer, scanning through hours of mostly empty highway. At 20:15, Pike's rig appeared, heading south toward Oljato. The timestamp matched his logbook entry. He was alone on the road, no other vehicles in sight. They kept watching. 10 minutes later, another vehicle appeared, also heading south. It was hard to make out details in the grainy footage, but it looked like a dark-colored pickup truck. It maintained a steady distance behind Pike's rig. Talon leaned closer to the screen. Is that following him? Marvin rewound and watched again. Could be coincidence. Same direction, same speed. But Talon wasn't convinced. He had a gut feeling about this. They continued watching the footage, but neither vehicle appeared again on any other camera. They had vanished into the stretch of highway where surveillance didn't reach. Marvin rubbed his eyes. We need more. Let's go back to the impound yard and check the rig again. Maybe we missed something. They drove back to Kayenta, arriving at the yard around noon. The rig sat exactly where they'd left it, baking in the desert sun. Talon walked around it again, looking for anything they might have overlooked. That's when he noticed the dash camera, a small device mounted on the windshield, partially hidden behind the sun visor. Marvin, look at this, dash cam. Marvin climbed into the cab and carefully removed the camera. Let's hope it recorded something useful. Back at the station, they connected the camera to Marvin's computer and started reviewing the footage. The camera had been recording continuously and the files were time-stamped. They skipped ahead to the evening of Pike's disappearance. At 20:30, the footage showed Pike driving south on US 163. Everything looked normal. The highway stretched out ahead, empty and dark. Pike's hands were visible on the steering wheel, occasionally reaching for his coffee thermos. At 21, something changed. Pike kept glancing in his mirrors, his body language tense. He reached for the CB radio and spoke into it, but there was no audio on the dashcam footage. Just Pike talking to himself, or trying to reach someone. At 21:15, Pike's eyes went wide. He stared into his rearview mirror, then his side mirror. His lips moved. Talon wished they had audio, and he started driving faster. The speedometer crept up from 65 to 75. Pike kept checking his mirrors. Whatever was behind him, it had him scared. At 21:28, Pike suddenly hit the brakes hard. The camera shook from the force. Pike turned the wheel sharply to the right, pulling off onto the shoulder. The rig came to a stop. Pike sat there for a moment, breathing hard, visible even in the dim light from the dashboard. Then he reached down and turned something, probably the engine off. No, wait. The dashboard lights stayed on. He'd left it running. Pike opened the door and stepped out of the cab. The camera angle didn't show what was outside, only the empty driver's seat and the open door. Pike stood there for a few seconds. Talon could see his shadow in the headlights, and then he walked away. The shadow moved to the right toward the back of the truck, and then it disappeared. The timestamp read 21:30. That was the last movement on the footage. For the next 2 hours, the camera recorded an empty cab, an open door, and the sound of wind howling through the opening. At 23:45, Talon's flashlight beam appeared in the frame, and the recording ended shortly after. Talon and Marvin sat in silence for a moment. He got out on his own, Talon said quietly. Whatever happened, he wasn't dragged out. He left voluntarily. Marvin nodded slowly. But why? What did he see that made him stop and get out? They rewound the footage, watching Pike's reaction in the minutes before he pulled over. His eyes kept darting to the mirrors. He was watching something behind him. Marvin paused the video and enhanced the image of the rearview mirror. In the reflection, barely visible, was a pair of headlights. They were close, maybe 50 feet behind the rig, too close for safe highway driving. That's what spooked him, Talon said. Someone was tailgating him. Marvin zoomed in further, but the resolution was too poor to make out any details about the vehicle, just two white lights in the darkness. We need to find that vehicle. They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing all available footage from other cameras in the area, but the dark pickup they'd seen earlier never appeared again. It was like it had vanished into thin air, just like Pike's tire tracks in the desert. As evening approached, Talon felt the case slipping through his fingers. They had a missing driver, an abandoned truck, mysterious tire tracks that led nowhere, and a phantom vehicle that couldn't be identified. Marvin suggested they drive back out to the site where the truck was found and search the area in daylight. Maybe they'd missed something in the dark. Talon agreed, and they headed out on US 163 as the sun began to set. The sky turned orange and purple, casting long shadows across Monument Valley's formations. They reached the spot at 1830 and parked on the shoulder where Pike's rig had been. The tire tracks were still visible, though the wind had softened their edges. Talon and Marvin followed them again, this time with better visibility. The tracks led into the scrubland, weaving slightly, and then ended in that same impossible spot. No continuation, no explanation. Marvin walked in expanding circles around the endpoint, searching for any clue they might have missed. Talon stood at the last tire impression, staring down at it. The sand around it was undisturbed, smooth and windswept. It didn't make sense. A vehicle heavy enough to leave those deep tracks didn't just lift off into the sky. He knelt down and ran his hand through the sand. It was cool to the touch, normal desert sand. But wait, there was something else. A smell, faint but distinct. Like ozone, the smell after a lightning strike. Talon stood up and called to Marvin. "Do you smell that?" Marvin walked over and sniffed the air. His expression changed. "Yeah, electrical smell. But there's no power lines out here." They looked around. The nearest power line was back on the highway, at least 50 yards away. There was no explanation for the ozone smell in the middle of the desert. Talon felt that chill again, the one that had nothing to do with temperature. Something happened here, something we don't understand. Marvin didn't respond. He was staring at something on the ground, a few feet from the last tire track. He walked over and crouched down. "Talon, come look at this." Talon joined him. There, partially buried in the sand, was a boot. A work boot, size 11, still laced up. Marvin carefully lifted it out of the sand. It was weathered but not old, and the sole was worn but intact. Inside the boot was a sock, and inside the sock, horrifyingly, were toes, human toes, severed cleanly at the ankle. Talon stumbled back, his hand going to his sidearm instinctively. Marvin set the boot down gently, his face pale. "We need to call this in. We're looking at a crime scene now." The crime scene unit arrived within 90 minutes, 3 officers and a forensic technician named Maris Bedoni. She was meticulous, photographing the boot from every angle before carefully bagging it as evidence. The severed toes would be sent to the medical examiner in Flagstaff for analysis. Talon and Marvin stood back, watching the team work as the last daylight faded from the sky. Floodlights were set up around the area, casting harsh white light across the desert sand. Every shadow looked suspicious now. Every sound felt amplified. Marvin was on his phone, coordinating with the department and requesting additional resources. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide investigation. Maris worked methodically, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to scan the area around where the boot had been found. If there were more remains buried nearby, she'd find them. Talon walked the perimeter, his flashlight beam sweeping across the scrubland. The ozone smell had faded, but something else lingered in the air now, something acrid and unpleasant like burning rubber. He couldn't pinpoint the source. The wind had picked up again, carrying sand and debris across the site. One of the crime scene officers called out from near the highway, "Sergeant Bigay, we've got something." Everyone converged on the officer's location. He was standing about 20 yards from where the rig had been parked, pointing his flashlight at the ground. There, partially covered by wind-blown sand, were drag marks, 2 parallel grooves, each about 4 inches wide, leading from the shoulder toward the spot where the tire tracks disappeared. Maris came over with her camera and documented them. "These are fresh," she said. "Made within the last 24 hours. Talon knelt beside them. Something was dragged, or someone. The grooves were deep, pressed into the hard-packed sand beneath the surface layer. Whatever made them was heavy. They followed the drag marks carefully, Maris photographing every few feet. The marks led directly to the end point of the tire tracks, then stopped. Just like the tire impressions, they simply ended with no continuation. Marvin radioed dispatch for additional units to secure the scene overnight. "We're treating this as an active crime scene until further notice. Nobody comes out here without authorization." Iona Key acknowledged and said she'd send 2 patrol units to establish a perimeter. As they waited for backup, Talon noticed something odd about the sand near the drag marks. It had a crystalline quality, like it had been exposed to extreme heat. He touched it carefully. It was cool, but when he lifted a handful, it fell through his fingers like tiny glass beads. Maris saw it too and collected samples. "I've never seen sand do this naturally. It's been vitrified, turned to glass. Takes temperatures over 3,000 degrees. Talon looked at Marvin. "No burn marks, no fire. How does sand melt without leaving scorch marks?" Nobody had an answer. The patrol units arrived and took up positions at either end of the scene. Talon and Marvin headed back to the station, arriving just after midnight. The boot, with its grisly contents, had already been sent to Flagstaff for analysis. Marvin immediately started working on a timeline, mapping out everything they knew about Ephraim Pike's last hours. Talon pulled up Pike's background check, looking for anything that might explain what happened. Pike was 28, unmarried, no criminal record. He'd been a truck driver for 6 years, worked for Desert Hall for the past 2. His personnel file showed solid performance reviews, no complaints, no incidents. He lived in a small apartment in Phoenix, kept to himself mostly. His emergency contact was listed as his sister in Tucson. Marvin made the call to notify her, a conversation Talon could hear from his desk. It was the worst part of the job, telling someone their loved one was likely dead. The sister, whose name was Rachel, broke down on the phone. She insisted her brother would never just abandon his truck. He was responsible, careful, not the type to take risks. After Marvin hung up, he sat quietly for a moment. She said Pike called her 2 nights ago. Said he'd been having bad dreams, kept dreaming about the highway at night, seeing things in his mirrors that weren't there when he looked back. Talon felt a chill. He told his dispatcher he thought someone was following him. Marvin nodded. Maybe he was right. Maybe someone was following him, and whatever happened out there, they made sure he couldn't talk about it. They decided to review the dash cam footage again. this time focusing on the minutes before Pike pulled over. Maybe there was something they'd missed, some detail that would give them a lead. They watched in slow motion as Pike drove south on US 163. The timestamp read 21:10. Pike's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his shoulders tense. He kept glancing at his mirrors. At 21:12, he reached for the CB radio again and spoke into it. His lips moved silently. Talon wished desperately they had audio. At 21:14, something caught Pike's attention. His head snapped to the left, looking out the driver's side window. He stared for several seconds, his expression shifting from confusion to fear. Then he jerked his head forward and accelerated. The speedometer climbed, 70, 75, 80 miles per hour. Pike was running from something. At 21:16, the rearview mirror reflection showed those headlights again, still behind him, matching his speed. But there was something else now. Something Marvin noticed when he paused the frame and enhanced it. Between the two headlights there was a third light, a red light, positioned higher than the others, almost like a beacon or warning light. Marvin zoomed in as far as the resolution would allow. The red light pulsed slowly, rhythmically, on and off, on and off. It was hypnotic in a way, even through the grainy footage. "What kind of vehicle has a setup like that?" Talon asked. Marvin shook his head. "Nothing I've ever seen. Could be custom." They continued watching. At 21:20, Pike's face was visible in profile as he turned to check his side mirror. His expression was pure terror. Whatever he was seeing had him completely spooked. At 21:22, he grabbed the CB radio again, this time more frantically. His lips moved rapidly. He was shouting into the radio, calling for help maybe. But on the CB recording they'd listened to earlier, there had been no distress call, only that strange looping pattern. At 21:25, Pike started tapping the brakes, not hard enough to slow down significantly, but rhythmically. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Like he was sending a signal. Marvin sat back in his chair. He's trying to communicate with whoever's behind him, or warn them off. But the headlights in the mirror didn't change. They maintained their distance, that red light still pulsing between them. At 21:27, something changed. The headlights suddenly accelerated, closing the gap rapidly. In the space of 3 seconds, they went from 50 feet back to 20 feet back. Pike panicked, yanking the wheel hard to the right. The camera shook violently as the rig swerved onto the shoulder. At 21:28, Pike hit the brakes hard, bringing the truck to a stop. The headlights in the mirror disappeared, just vanished, like they'd never been there. Pike sat in the driver's seat, breathing hard, looking around frantically. He checked all his mirrors, craning his neck to see out the back. Nothing. The highway behind him was empty. Dark. No headlights, no red light, nothing. Pike sat there for maybe 30 seconds, his chest heaving. Then he reached down and did something with his hands. Looked like he was adjusting something on his belt. Talon squinted at the screen. Is he checking his weapon? Marvin enhanced the image. Pike had lifted his shirt slightly, revealing a holster on his hip. He unsnapped the retention strap, letting his hand rest on the grip of what looked like a pistol. He was armed. Pike opened the door and stepped out of the cab, leaving the engine running and the lights on. The camera angle didn't show what was outside, but Pike's shadow was visible in the headlights, stretching out long across the pavement. He stood there, hand on his weapon, looking around. His shadow turned slowly, like he was scanning the area. Then it moved to the right, toward the rear of the trailer. And then it stopped, just froze in place for several seconds. When it moved again, it was quick, almost running. Pike's shadow disappeared from view, and then there was nothing. Just the empty cab, the open door, and the sound of wind through the microphone. Talon checked the timestamp. Pike had been out of the cab for exactly 42 seconds before his shadow vanished. What made him run? Marvin rewound and watched Pike's shadow again. When it froze, right before he started running, the shadow's posture changed. The arm that had been resting on his weapon lifted, pointing at something, like he'd drawn his gun and aimed it. Then he ran. He saw something, Marvin said quietly. Something that made him draw his weapon and run. They let the footage play out. For the next 2 hours, nothing moved except the occasional tumbleweed rolling past the open door. At 23:43, Talon's flashlight beam appeared, and the recording ended. Marvin saved the enhanced sections and emailed them to the FBI's field office in Albuquerque. The Navajo Nation had jurisdiction over the case, but if this turned into something bigger, human trafficking, interstate crime, they'd need federal assistance. While they waited for a response, Talon pulled up a map of the area and started marking locations. The spot where Pike's rig was found, the end point of the tire tracks, the location where they'd found the boot. He stared at the map, looking for patterns. The 3 points formed a rough triangle, with the highway running along one edge. He measured the distances. From the rig to the tire track endpoint, 64 yards. From the tire track endpoint to the boot location, 18 feet. Almost like something had moved in stages. Marvin came over and looked at the map. You thinking the body was moved? Talon nodded slowly. Pike gets out of his truck, walks back toward the trailer, sees something that makes him draw his weapon. Then he runs, or is chased, into the desert. 64 yards later, whatever happened to him happened there. Then somebody, or something, dragged part of him 18 feet and buried the boot. Marvin considered this. The drag marks led from the highway to the endpoint. So the body would have been dragged in that direction, not away from it. Talon frowned. That doesn't make sense. Why drag a body toward the highway? Before Marvin could respond, the station's front door opened and Officer Rowan Chi walked in, shaking sand from his jacket. Rowan was younger than Talon, maybe 25, with sharp eyes and a habit of noticing details others missed. He'd been one of the officers securing the crime scene overnight. Thought you two should know, Rowan said. We found something else out there. He pulled out his phone and showed them a photo. It was a tire track, but not like the ones they'd been following. This one was different, wider, with a distinctive tread pattern. Found it about 100 yards west of the crime scene, partially covered by sand. Looks fresh. Marvin studied the photo. Different vehicle from Pike's rig. Rowan nodded. Yeah, and it gets weirder. The track leads toward the crime scene, but then it circles around it. Like whoever was driving stopped, sat there for a while, then left. Talon felt his pulse quicken. Someone was watching, waiting to see what we'd find. Marvin grabbed his jacket. Show us. The 3 officers drove back out to US 163, arriving just as the sun was rising. The crime scene was still secured, floodlights casting shadows across the sand. Rowan led them to the new tire track, about 100 yards west and slightly north of where Pike's rig had been found. The track was clear now in the daylight, pressed deep into the sand. Maris was already there, photographing it. This is from a heavy-duty pickup truck, she said. Probably 3/4 ton or larger. Tread pattern matches several commercial brands, but I'll need to run it through the database to narrow it down. Talon knelt beside the track and followed its path. It came in from the west, approached to within 50 yards of the crime scene, then made a wide loop and headed back the way it came. At the closest point to the crime scene, there were scuff marks in the sand, like someone had gotten out of the vehicle and stood there. Maris took samples from the scuff marks and found a partial boot print. Size 12, work boot style, different from Pike's size 11. "Someone was here," Talon said. "While Pike was out there dying, someone was standing right here watching." Marvin's jaw tightened. "Can we track where the vehicle came from or went?" Maris shook her head. "Trail goes cold about a quarter mile in both directions. Winds erased most of it." Talon stood up and looked toward the horizon. The sun was fully up now, painting the mesas orange and red. Monument Valley stretched out in all directions, vast and empty. Somewhere out there, someone knew what had happened to Ephraim Pike. Someone had watched it happen and done nothing, or worse, had made it happen. Back at the station, Talon couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he looked out the window, he half expected to see a dark pickup truck sitting across the street. Marvin was on the phone with the FBI, explaining the situation and requesting their assistance. Talon pulled up the traffic camera footage again, this time looking for the mystery pickup. He went back further, scanning through hours of footage from the previous week. At 03:22 on Wednesday morning, 6 days before Pike's disappearance, a dark pickup truck appeared on the camera near Mexican Hat. It was heading south on US 163, same direction Pike usually traveled. The truck was moving slowly, like it was searching for something. Talon watched as the truck passed the camera, then pulled over onto the shoulder about 100 yards down the road. It sat there for 17 minutes, engine running, headlights on. Then it pulled back onto the highway and continued south, disappearing from view. Talon checked the next night's footage. The same truck appeared at 03:18, following the exact same pattern. Pulled over, waited, then continued. This happened 4 nights in a row, always between 03:15 and 3:30. On the 5th night, the truck didn't appear. That was the night Pike disappeared. Talon called Marvin over and showed him the footage. Someone was staking out the road, waiting for Pike. Marvin enhanced the image of the truck as much as possible. It was definitely a heavy-duty pickup, dark blue or black, with an extended cab. There was some kind of equipment mounted in the bed, covered with a tarp. The license plate was obscured, either deliberately or by mud. But there was one distinctive feature. On the roof of the cab, above the rear window, was a light bar. Not unusual for work trucks, but the configuration was odd. 3 lights in a row, 2 white spotlights on either end and a red emergency light in the center. Talon's blood ran cold. That's the red light Pike saw, the one pulsing in his rearview mirror. They had their vehicle. Now they needed to find it. Marvin sent the enhanced images to every law enforcement agency in the Four Corners area with a bolo. Be on the lookout. Dark pickup, heavy duty, custom light bar on the roof. Considered connected to a homicide investigation. Approach with caution. Talon started calling truck stops and gas stations along US 163, asking if anyone had seen a vehicle matching that description. Most calls went nowhere, but at a small fuel station near Bluff, Utah, the owner remembered something. "Yeah, I seen a truck like that. Came through here maybe a week ago late at night. Guy filled up, paid cash, didn't say much." Talon asked if the station had security cameras. The owner, whose name was Orson Kepler, said yes, but the system was old and only kept footage for 72 hours. The recording from a week ago would be gone. Talon asked Orson to describe the driver. Tall guy, maybe 6'2", 6'3", white, probably in his 40s. Had a baseball cap, pulled low, sunglasses even though it was nighttime. Didn't get a good look at his face. Talon asked about the truck. Had New Mexico plates, I think, or maybe Arizona. one of those desert states. And yeah, it had that light bar on top. Thought it was weird, the red light in the middle. Never seen that before. Talon thanked Orson and hung up. They had a partial description of the suspect now. White male, 40s, over 6 feet tall, driving a dark pickup with out-of-state plates and a custom light bar. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had an hour ago. Marvin was still on the phone with the FBI. When he hung up, he looked grim. FBI sending 2 agents down from Albuquerque. They'll be here tomorrow morning. They're also running the tire tread and boot print through their databases, see if anything matches previous cases. Talon asked if the FBI thought this could be connected to other disappearances. Marvin nodded. They've had 3 unsolved trucker disappearances along southwestern highways in the past 18 months. All similar circumstances. Empty rigs found abandoned, drivers vanished without a trace. The implications hung heavy in the air. If this was a serial predator targeting truck drivers, Pike was just the latest victim, and whoever was responsible was still out there, hunting. Talon thought about the CB radio in Pike's truck, that looping pattern they'd heard. He went back to the evidence locker and retrieved the digital recorder they'd used to capture the audio. He plugged it into his computer and played it again, listening carefully. The pattern was definitely there, repeating every 7 seconds. It almost sounded like words, but distorted beyond recognition. He slowed down the playback speed, dropping it to half normal speed. Now he could hear it more clearly. It was words, someone saying something, over and over. Talon played it for Marvin, even slowed down. It was hard to make out, but certain syllables were recognizable. Help. Can't. Watching. Marvin's eyes widened. That's Pike. He was trying to call for help on the CB, but something was interfering with the signal. Talon nodded. And whatever was interfering, it's still there. That's why the message is looping. The interference is keeping it trapped in the radio. Marvin didn't look convinced about the supernatural implications, but he couldn't deny what they were hearing. They saved the audio file and added it to the evidence package for the FBI. By late afternoon, Talon was exhausted. He'd been awake for over 30 hours, running on coffee and adrenaline. Marvin sent him home to get some rest. We've got officers watching the crime scene and the impound yard. Go home, sleep, come back fresh tomorrow when the FBI arrives. Talon reluctantly agreed and drove home. But when he pulled into his driveway, something felt wrong. His front door was slightly ajar. He always locked it. Always. Talon drew his weapon and called for backup, then cautiously approached the house. The door creaked open at his touch. Inside, everything looked normal. No signs of forced entry, nothing disturbed. But someone had been here. He could feel it. He cleared each room methodically, weapon raised, checking corners and closets. The house was empty. But on his kitchen table, something that hadn't been there this morning, a photograph. Talon approached it carefully, not touching it. The photo showed Ephraim Pike's abandoned rig, taken from an angle high above, like someone had been on a mesa looking down. In the bottom right corner of the photo, visible in the glow of the rig's headlights, were 2 figures. One was clearly Pike, identifiable by his build and clothing. The other was taller, darker, its features obscured by shadow. The photo's timestamp read 21:29, 1 minute after Pike had gotten out of his truck. Talon's hands trembled as he called Marvin. Someone broke into my house, left a photograph. Marvin, they were there. They photographed Pike right before he died. Marvin told him to secure the scene and not touch anything. He was on his way. Talon stood in his kitchen, staring at the photograph, his mind racing. Whoever had taken this picture had been watching Pike, had followed him, had probably killed him. And now they were sending a message to the police. We know who you are, we know where you live, and we can get to you whenever we want. The investigation had just become personal. Marvin arrived within 20 minutes, bringing Officer Rowan Chi and Maris Bedoni with him. They processed Talon's house like any other crime scene, dusting for prints, checking windows and doors for signs of forced entry, photographing the mysterious image on the kitchen table. Maris carefully bagged the photograph as evidence, handling it with latex gloves. "No fingerprints on the surface," she said after a preliminary examination. "Whoever left this was careful." Talon sat on his front porch while they worked, his service weapon in his lap, eyes scanning the street. Every car that passed made his hand drift towards the grip. Every shadow looked like a threat. Marvin came out and sat beside him. Windows in the back bedroom had the lock tampered with. Professional job, no damage, just defeated the mechanism. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. Talon stared at the darkening sky. "They're trying to scare us off the case." Marvin shook his head. "I don't think so. If they wanted us scared, they would have done something more direct. This is different. They're showing us what they can do, proving they're in control." Talon turned to look at him. "So, what do we do?" Marvin's jaw tightened. "We don't get scared. We work the case harder. And we find this son of a bitch before he takes another victim." Rowan came out with his notepad. "I talked to your neighbors. Mrs. Tahoma across the street said she saw a dark pickup truck parked on this street around 2 this afternoon. Driver stayed in the vehicle for maybe 10 minutes, then left. She didn't get a plate number, but the description matches our suspect vehicle." Talon felt his stomach drop. The killer had been watching his house in broad daylight, waiting for him to leave so they could break in and deliver their message. "Mrs. Tahoma notice anything else about the truck or driver?" Rowan shook his head. "Just that it had some kind of equipment rack on the roof. Said it looked like something a contractor might drive." Maris emerged from the house carrying her equipment cases. "I've got everything we need. Talon, you shouldn't stay here tonight. If they came once, they might come back." Talon knew she was right, but he hated the idea of being driven from his own home. Marvin must have sensed his resistance. "Stay with me tonight. My place has a security system and I've got a spare room. We'll post a unit here to watch your house, catch them if they try to come back." Talon reluctantly agreed. He packed a bag and followed Marvin to his place on the other side of Kayenta. Rowan stayed behind with another officer to set up surveillance on Talon's house. At Marvin's place, Talon couldn't sleep. He sat in the spare bedroom, staring at the photograph on his phone, the one Maris had sent him of the image left on his table. The shadowy figure standing next to Pike was barely visible, more suggestion than substance. But something about its posture was wrong. The proportions seemed off, limbs too long, stance too wide. Talon zoomed in as far as the image resolution would allow, but the details dissolved into pixels. At 0230, his phone rang. It was Rowan. "Talon, you need to get back here. Something's happening at your house." Talon and Marvin drove to Talon's place in under 10 minutes, lights flashing but no siren. When they arrived, Rowan and the other officer were standing in the front yard, flashlights pointed at the roof. "Look, Rowan said, directing his beam upward. On the roof, clearly visible in the flashlight glow, was something that hadn't been there before. A symbol, maybe 8 feet across, drawn in what looked like ash or charcoal. It was geometric, angular, with lines radiating from a central point like a twisted star. Talon felt cold looking at it. When did that appear? Rowan checked his watch. "We've been watching the house for 6 hours. Did a walk around every 30 minutes. It wasn't there at 02 Okui. We found it at 2:15. Marvin stared at the symbol. 15-minute window. Someone climbed onto Talon's roof, drew this, and got away without you seeing them? Rowan looked embarrassed. We were watching the street, the front and back doors. Didn't think to watch the roof. Marvin didn't criticize him further. Instead, he called Maris and asked her to come back out. While they waited, Talon grabbed a ladder from his garage and climbed up to examine the symbol more closely. The lines were precise, drawn with purpose. The substance used was definitely ash, still slightly warm to the touch. Talon pulled out his phone and took several photos from different angles. When Maris arrived, she climbed up and took samples of the ash. I'll run tests, but my guess is this is wood ash, maybe mixed with something else. The warmth suggests it was applied recently, within the last hour. She photographed the symbol extensively, then helped Talon measure its dimensions. 8 feet, 2 inches in diameter, perfectly circular outer boundary with the angular design inscribed within. I've never seen anything like this, Maris admitted. It's not Navajo, not any tribal marking I recognize. Talon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It's a message, just like the photograph. They stayed at the house until dawn, but no one returned. The symbol remained on the roof, stark and ominous in the growing light. Marvin made the decision to have it photographed extensively before removing it, in case it became important evidence later. By 07 o'clock, Talon was back at the station, exhausted and running on fumes. The FBI agents were due to arrive at 09 o'clock, and he wanted to have everything organized for them. He compiled all the evidence, the dashcam footage, the photograph from his kitchen table, images of the roof symbol, forensic reports on the boot and severed toes, traffic camera footage of the mystery pickup truck. At 08:45, 2 FBI agents walked through the station door. The lead agent was a woman in her late 30s named Special Agent Victoria Hale, sharp-eyed and professional. Her partner was Agent Darren Nez, a Navajo man in his early 40s who'd grown up on the reservation before joining the Bureau. They settled into the conference room and Talon walked them through everything. Agent Hale listened intently, taking notes on a tablet. When Talon finished, she sat back and exchanged a glance with Agent Nez. "This matches patterns we've been seeing," she said carefully. 3 other trucker disappearances in the past 18 months, all along southwestern highways, all with similar circumstances. Agent Nez pulled up a map on his laptop and projected it onto the conference room screen. Red dots marked locations across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. May 2023, I-40 east of Flagstaff. Trucker named Marcus Valdez vanished from his rig. Truck found abandoned, engine running, no sign of struggle, no body recovered. He clicked to the next marker. September 2023, Highway 191 south of Moab. Driver named Sarah Kendrick disappeared. Same scenario. Running truck, no driver, no body. Family reported she'd been complaining about strange vehicles following her at night. Another click. January 2024, Highway 60 near Springerville. Trucker named Raymond Cross. You can guess what we found. Talon leaned forward. Were there any physical remains recovered in those cases? Agent Hale shook her head. Nothing. No bodies, no blood, no evidence of foul play except for the abandoned vehicles. Local jurisdictions investigated, but had nothing to go on. Cases went cold. She paused. Until now, the boot with the severed toes. That's the first physical evidence we've had that these disappearances are homicides. Marvin asked the obvious question. Why truck drivers? What's the connection? Agent Nez brought up profiles of the victims. All solo drivers, all running night routes through remote areas. All reported feeling watched or followed in the days before they disappeared. Agent Hale added, and there's something else. In each case, local law enforcement reported unusual phenomena near the disappearance sites. Strange lights, electronic interference, reports of vehicles that couldn't be tracked. We initially dismissed it as coincidence or misreporting, but now, she trailed off, looking at the symbol photograph. Now we're not so sure. Talon showed them the roof symbol images. Any idea what this means? Agent Nez studied it carefully, then shook his head. It's not any traditional Navajo symbolism. Could be something the suspect created themselves or borrowed from another source. We'll run it through our database of gang signs, cult symbols, see if anything matches. They spent the next 2 hours going over every detail of the case. Agent Hale was particularly interested in the CB radio recording with its looping distress call. That's unusual. We've seen evidence tampering before, but never anything quite like this. It's almost like the signal is caught in some kind of feedback loop. She made a note to have the FBI's technical division analyze it. By noon, they had a working theory. Someone was systematically targeting truck drivers on remote southwestern highways, using a dark pickup truck with a distinctive light configuration. The suspect was organized, technically sophisticated, and willing to directly intimidate law enforcement investigating the crimes. We need to set a trap, Agent Hale said. Use ourselves as bait. She proposed having an undercover agent pose as a truck driver, running the same routes where the previous disappearances had occurred. If our suspect is still active, they might take the bait. Marvin wasn't enthusiastic. That's putting someone directly in harm's way. We don't even know what we're dealing with yet. Agent Nez nodded. Marvin's right. We need more information first. Let's focus on identifying the suspect vehicle. If we can track down that pickup truck, we can surveil the owner, build a case before we move in. Talon's phone buzzed. A text from Maris. Need you at the lab, found something in the ash samples. He excused himself and drove to the forensic lab, a small building attached to the regional medical center. Maris met him at the door, her expression troubled. The ash from your roof, it's not just wood ash. There's bone ash mixed in. Talon felt his stomach turn. Human? Maris nodded slowly. I'll need to send samples to Flagstaff for DNA analysis to be certain. But yes, I believe it's human bone that's been cremated and ground into powder. She led him to her microscope. Look at this. Under magnification, the ash showed fragments of calcified tissue, unmistakably bone. Maris had already measured the calcium to phosphate ratio, confirming it matched human bone composition. Whoever left this on your roof wasn't just sending a message. They were showing you what they do to their victims. Talon stepped back from the microscope, his mind reeling. The killer was cremating the bodies, grinding them into ash, using them as, what, marking territory, claiming ownership? Have you told Agent Hale about this? Maris shook her head. You're my first call. I wanted you to know before it becomes part of the official record. Talon thanked her and called Marvin immediately. The ash on my roof, it contains human remains, cremated bone powder. There was a long silence on the other end, then Marvin's voice tight with controlled anger. This son of a bitch is taunting us with his victims. Get back here. We need to brief the FBI. Back at the station, Agent Hale's expression darkened as she heard the news. If the suspect is cremating victims and using their remains this way, we're looking at someone with access to cremation facilities, or someone who's built their own. She turned to Agent Nez. Start pulling records on crematoriums in the Four Corners area. Also, check for property records. Anyone who owns land remote enough to operate an illegal cremation operation. While the FBI agents worked their angle, Talon returned to his desk and pulled up the CB radio recording again. He'd been thinking about it all morning. If Pike's distress call was stuck in a loop, maybe there was more information embedded in the signal that they hadn't heard yet. He loaded the audio into a sound analysis program and started running filters. removing layers of static and noise. Slowly, other sounds emerged from beneath Pike's voice. Footsteps, heavy, rhythmic footsteps. Then breathing, deep and slow. And underneath it all, something else. A low-frequency hum, almost below the range of human hearing. Talon isolated the hum and amplified it. The sound was mechanical, like an engine or generator, but the frequency was wrong for any vehicle he knew. It pulsed at irregular intervals, 20 seconds on, 5 seconds off, repeating endlessly. He checked the timestamp on the recording. The hum had started at 21:31, 2 minutes after Pike left his truck, and it continued for exactly 42 minutes before cutting off abruptly at 22:13. Talon pulled up the dashcam footage and checked the timeline. Pike's shadow had disappeared at 21:30. The hum started 1 minute later. Whatever had happened to Pike had taken 42 minutes. He called Marvin and the FBI agents over and played the isolated audio. Agent Hale listened intently, then asked Talon to play it again. That's not a standard combustion engine. The frequency's too low and too consistent. Could be industrial equipment, a generator maybe, or some kind of specialized machinery. Agent Nez leaned closer to the speaker. Play the footsteps again. Talon isolated that portion of the audio. The footsteps were heavy, boots on hard ground, but the rhythm was off. Most people walk with a 2-beat pattern, left, right, left, right. These footsteps had a 3-beat pattern, step, step, drag, step, step, drag. Someone with a leg injury? Marvin suggested. Agent Hale shook her head. Or someone carrying something heavy, that dragging sound could be from pulling a weight. The implication hung in the air. The footsteps were recorded while Pike was still alive, while his distress call was transmitting. Someone had been walking around out there dragging something, or dragging someone. Talon felt sick. They'd been listening to the sounds of Pike being murdered, captured by his own CB radio. Can we use this to identify the location? Agent Nez asked. The acoustics might tell us something about the environment. Talon ran another analysis, this time focusing on reverb and echo patterns. The results were strange. The sounds had almost no echo, which suggested an open outdoor space. But there was also a subtle resonance, like the sounds were bouncing off something vertical and hard. Rock, maybe. A cliff face or canyon wall. Talon pulled up his map of the area and looked at the topology. The nearest significant rock formation to the disappearance site was about half a mile south, a small mesa rising about 200 feet above the desert floor. Could be there, he said, pointing. If Pike was taken to the base of that mesa, the acoustics would match what we're hearing. Marvin grabbed his keys. Let's go check it out. They assembled a team. Talon, Marvin, Rowan, the 2 FBI agents, and Maris. 6 vehicles headed out to the mesa in mid-afternoon. The drive took 40 minutes, following paved roads and then rough dirt tracks. The mesa rose before them, rust-red stone against a bright blue sky. They parked at the base and started searching on foot. The terrain was rough, covered in scrub brush and loose rock. After 20 minutes of searching, Rowan called out, "Over here!" He'd found something at the base of the mesa's north face. It was a burn site, a large circular area, maybe 10 feet in diameter, where the ground had been scorched black. The sand had vitrified, turned to glass, just like at the site where they'd found Pike's boot. In the center of the circle was a metal frame, crude but functional, standing about 6 feet tall. It looked like it might have been used to suspend something, or someone, above the fire. Maris immediately started taking samples and photographs. This is our primary crime scene. This is where Pike was killed. She pointed to drag marks leading from the edge of the burn site toward a shallow ravine. And that's where they disposed of evidence. They followed the drag marks. In the ravine, scattered among rocks and brush, they found more remains, bone fragments, pieces of fabric, metal buckles from clothing. Everything was charred, damaged by extreme heat. Maris collected what she could, but it was clear that most of the body had been completely destroyed. Cremation temperatures typically run 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, she explained. This fire was hotter than that. Look at the bone fragments. They're completely calcified, crumbling to powder. That takes temperatures over 2000 degrees. She looked around at the desolate landscape. Someone built a furnace out here, a place to destroy evidence completely. Agent Hale was documenting the scene with her camera. This level of organization suggests our suspect has done this before, multiple times. They've refined their process. Agent Nez was examining the metal frame. This is welded steel, professional quality work. Our suspect has metalworking skills. He pointed to marks on the frame's base. And look at this. Bolt holes. This frame can be disassembled and transported. They bring it to different locations, set it up, use it, then break it down and move on. The implications were chilling. They were hunting someone who'd turned murder into a mobile operation. Someone who could strike anywhere along hundreds of miles of highway. Talon walked the perimeter of the burn site, looking for any clue the killer might have left behind. That's when he found the tire tracks. They were partially obscured by wind and sand, but they were there. The same distinctive tread pattern they'd photographed near Pike's disappearance site. The truck had been here. The killer had driven right up to the mesa, unloaded their equipment, and conducted their horrific work. Talon followed the tracks as far as he could. They led away from the mesa, heading northwest across open desert. After about 100 yards, they disappeared into hard-packed ground where tracks couldn't form. But before they vanished, the tracks passed near a cluster of rocks. Talon walked over to investigate and found something tucked into a crevice between two boulders. A small camera, wireless and battery-powered, positioned to watch the burn site. It was still recording. Talon's blood ran cold. He called everyone over. "They're watching us! Right now!" Agent Hale immediately radioed for backup and called the FBI's technical team. "Don't touch it. Could be booby-trapped." They secured the area and waited for the bomb squad from Farmington to arrive. While they waited, Talon couldn't shake the feeling of invisible eyes on him. The killer was out there somewhere, watching them discover his work, probably enjoying their horror. The bomb squad arrived 2 hours later and carefully examined the camera. It wasn't explosive, just a simple surveillance device with a wireless transmitter. The signal was being sent to a receiver somewhere within a 5-mile radius. The technical team traced the signal as best they could, but it was bouncing through several relay points, making the source impossible to pinpoint. "Whoever set this up knew what they were doing," the lead tech said. "Military-grade encryption, professional installation. This isn't amateur hour." They carefully removed the camera and bagged it as evidence, but everyone knew the damage was done. The killer had watched them find the crime scene. As the sun began to set, they packed up and headed back to Kayenta. The mood was somber. They'd found where Pike had been killed, confirmed the manner of death, but they were no closer to identifying the killer. If anything, the case had become more disturbing. They were hunting someone with technical sophistication, metalworking skills, knowledge of remote desert locations, and the willingness to directly surveil law enforcement. Agent Hale called a meeting at the station for that evening. "We need to change tactics. This suspect is bold, organized, and always one step ahead. We need to stop reacting and start predicting." She laid out a new strategy. "We've identified a pattern: remote highways, nighttime hours, solo truck drivers. We also know the suspect uses a distinctive vehicle and follows victims for days before striking. So, we set up monitoring on every major trucking route in the Four Corners area. Highway Patrol, Tribal Police, FBI, everyone watches for that dark pickup. The moment it appears, we track it back to its base of operations. Marvin asked the obvious question. What about the next trucker they target? We're using civilians as bait. Agent Hale's expression was grim. I don't like it either, but we're racing against time. Every day that passes is another day this killer could strike again. The meeting broke up around 22. Talon went back to Marvin's place, too wired to sleep. He sat in the spare bedroom, going over the case files again and again. Something was bothering him, a detail he couldn't quite place. He pulled up the traffic camera footage from the night Pike disappeared, watching the dark pickup follow Pike's rig. Then he pulled up the footage from the previous nights, watching the same truck stake out the route. On the fourth night, Wednesday, the truck pulled over and waited for 17 minutes. Talon zoomed in on the image, enhancing it as much as possible. In the truck's bed, under the tarp, something was visible at the edge, a corner of the metal frame Maris had found at the burn site. But that wasn't what caught Talon's attention. It was something on the truck's rear bumper. A sticker, partially obscured but visible in the right light. Talon adjusted the contrast and brightness, sharpening the image. The sticker showed a logo, a stylized mountain peak with a radio tower on top. Underneath, barely legible text read, Desert Communications Network. Talon's heart raced. He did a quick internet search. Desert Communications Network was a private company that installed and maintained radio and cell towers throughout the Southwest. They had a regional office in Farmington. Talon immediately called Marvin, not caring about the late hour. I found something. The suspect vehicle has a company sticker, Desert Communications Network, Farmington office. Marvin was quiet for a moment, then, a communications company would explain the technical sophistication, the encryption, the surveillance equipment, the ability to interfere with CB radios. Talon felt like he was finally getting somewhere. We need employee records from that company, anyone who drives a dark, heavy-duty pickup and has access to their equipment. Marvin agreed. I'll call Agent Hale. We'll get a warrant first thing in the morning. But morning felt like a long way off. Talon lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything they'd learned. A killer who cremated victims and used their ashes to mark territory, who followed truck drivers for days before striking, who had the technical skills to interfere with radios and set up surveillance networks, who drove a distinctive pickup truck and worked, or had worked, for a communications company. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was deeply unsettling. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was methodical, ritualized, almost ceremonial. The killer wasn't just murdering people, they were transforming them into ash, and using them for some purpose the investigators couldn't yet understand. At 03:17, Talon's phone rang, shattering the silence. It was Officer Rowan. His voice was tense, breathless. Talon, we've got another one. A semi-truck found abandoned on Highway 191 north of Bluff. Engine running, driver gone. It's happening again. Talon, Marvin, and the FBI agents converged on the scene within 45 minutes. Highway 191 stretched out before them, a black ribbon cutting through the desert under a sky full of stars. The abandoned semi sat on the shoulder, exactly as Rowan had described. Engine running, lights on, driver missing. This rig was different from Pike's, though. It was a refrigerated trailer, the cooling unit humming steadily. The cab door hung open, interior lights illuminating an empty driver's seat. Talon approached cautiously, his hand resting on his sidearm. Everything about this felt like a repeat of Pike's case, and that made him deeply uneasy. Agent Hale was already coordinating with local units to establish a perimeter. Nobody goes anywhere near that truck until we've processed it completely, and I want aerial surveillance up now. If our suspect is still in the area, we might be able to spot them." Agent Nez was on his phone with the FBI's technical team requesting signal analysis equipment. "If the CB radio's been tampered with, like in Pike's case, I want to know immediately." Marvin walked the shoulder, shining his flashlight on the ground, looking for tire tracks. Talon joined him. Within minutes, they found them, the same distinctive tread pattern, leading off the highway and into the scrubland. "They're following the same playbook," Marvin said quietly. Talon nodded, feeling cold despite the warm night air. "Which means somewhere out there, right now, another person is dying." They couldn't follow the tracks immediately, not until the crime scene unit arrived and documented everything. But every minute they waited was another minute the killer had to complete their work and disappear. Agent Hale seemed to read Talon's thoughts. "I know what you're thinking, but we do this right. If we contaminate evidence now, we lose the case in court later." She was right, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. The crime scene unit arrived at Euro 415, led by Maris. She'd been roused from sleep and looked exhausted, but her focus was sharp. She immediately began processing the rig, starting with the cab. The driver's logbook was on the passenger seat, open to today's date. The last entry showed a departure from Farmington at 20 Unquap, destination Moab. Driver's name, Della Varon. Talon felt his stomach drop. He knew that name. Della ran a small truck stop diner near Bluff, but she also drove part-time for extra income. She was in her 50s, tough as nails, with a sharp wit and a kind heart. And now she was missing. Maris found Della's cell phone wedged between the seats. The screen was cracked but still functional. The last call had been to 911 at Aero 247. Maris played the recording. Della's voice came through, shaky and breathless. "This is Della Varon. I'm on Highway 191 northbound, mile marker 23. There's a truck following me, has been for the last hour. Dark-colored, some kind of lights on top. They keep getting close, then dropping back. I think they're trying to run me off the road." The dispatcher's voice. "Ma'am, can you see a license plate?" Della. "No, they're keeping their distance now. Wait, they're speeding up again. They're right on my—" The call cut off abruptly with a crash and static. Everyone listening felt the weight of that moment. Della had called for help, and somehow they hadn't gotten there in time. Agent Hale's face was grim. "Play it again." They listened 3 more times, analyzing every sound. At the end, just before the call cut off, there was something else. A sound like metal scraping metal. And then what might have been Della screaming. Or it might have been tire noise. The audio was too distorted to tell. Agent Nez checked the 911 records. Call came in at 0247. Nearest patrol unit was dispatched at 0248. Arrived at 0305. Found the rig abandoned. Della was gone in less than 20 minutes. Talon walked around to the back of the trailer and checked the cargo doors. They were sealed, refrigeration unit still running. He could hear it cycling, maintaining whatever temperature was set. What was she hauling? Maris checked the manifest clipped to a holder on the trailer's side. Produce, lettuce, tomatoes, bell peppers. Destination was a grocery warehouse in Moab. Standard cargo, nothing that would make Della a specific target, which meant the killer was choosing victims based on opportunity, solo drivers on remote roads at night. Anyone could be next. Maris opened the trailer doors carefully. Cold air billowed out, and the smell of fresh vegetables filled the night. The cargo was intact, pallets of produce stacked and secured with straps. Everything looked normal. But as Maris stepped inside with her flashlight, she found something that shouldn't have been there. On the trailer's interior wall, drawn in what looked like condensation or frost, was that same angular symbol they'd found on Talon's roof. He was inside the trailer, Maris said quietly. Either before Della started her drive, or after he took her, he left his mark. Talon climbed into the trailer to look closer. The symbol was about 3 feet across, drawn with a finger through the frost that had accumulated on the metal wall. It was precise, deliberate, identical to the one on his roof. Maris photographed it from every angle before it could melt. This confirms what we suspected, the killer's using the symbol as a signature, marking his territory, his victims. Agent Hale joined them in the trailer. Or it's part of a ritual. Serial offenders sometimes develop elaborate rituals around their crimes. The symbol could be psychologically significant to the killer. They finished processing the rig by dawn. The tire tracks leading off the highway were photographed and cast, then followed on foot. Just like with Pike's case, they led into the desert for about 60 yards before ending inexplicably. No continuation, no explanation. But this time they found something different. At the end point, half buried in sand, was a piece of fabric. Maris carefully extracted it. A strip of denim, torn and blood-stained. She checked it against photos of what Della had been wearing when she'd left Farmington. Della's dispatch supervisor had described her outfit. Jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. The denim matched. Agent Nez coordinated aerial surveillance using a police helicopter equipped with thermal imaging. The helicopter made sweeping passes over the area, searching for heat signatures that might indicate a person or vehicle. Nothing. The desert stretched out in all directions, empty and indifferent. If Della was out there, she was already beyond the help of thermal cameras. Or she'd been taken somewhere the helicopter couldn't see. Talon thought about the burn site they'd found, how it had been hidden at the base of a mesa. There were dozens of similar formations in the area, hundreds of places the killer could hide. Back at the station, the team reassembled to brief on what they'd found. Agent Hale had already been in contact with Desert Communications Network's regional manager, and a warrant had been expedited through a federal judge. They would have access to employee records by noon. We're looking for current or former employees who drive a dark, heavy-duty pickup and have advanced technical skills, Agent Hale explained. Cross-reference that with anyone who has a history of violence, restraining orders, anything that suggests predatory behavior. The work was painstaking, but it was their best lead. While the FBI agents coordinated with DCN, Talon and Marvin drove out to Della's truck stop diner. They needed to talk to her employees, see if anyone had noticed anything unusual in recent days. The diner sat at the junction of Highways 191 and 163, a low-slung building with a gravel parking lot and a neon sign that read Della's. Inside, 3 employees were preparing for the morning rush, their faces drawn with worry. News of Della's disappearance had already spread. Her assistant manager, a young woman named Ruthie Calder, met them at the door. "Have you found her?" Talon shook his head. "Not yet, but we're doing everything we can." Ruthie led them to a back office where they could talk privately. She'd worked for Della for 5 years and knew her habits well. Della only drove trucks on weekends, extra money for her retirement fund. She'd done that Farmington Moab run dozens of times, knew the route like the back of her hand. Talon asked if Della had mentioned anything unusual recently, any problems or concerns. Ruthie hesitated. "Actually, yeah, about 2 weeks ago, she said someone had been hanging around the parking lot at night. Said she'd seen a dark truck parked out there multiple times, just sitting with the engine running. She thought maybe it was a driver taking a break, but it made her nervous." Marvin leaned forward. "Did she report it to anyone?" Ruthie shook her head. She didn't want to bother the police with something that might be nothing. but she started locking all the doors at night and keeping her shotgun behind the counter. She paused. I should have told her to call you guys. Maybe if I had, she'd still be here. Talon assured her that this wasn't her fault, but he could see the guilt eating at her. They asked to see the parking lot's security camera footage. Della had a basic system set up, recording on a loop that kept 7 days of video before overwriting. The footage showed exactly what Ruthie had described. On 3 different nights over the past 2 weeks, a dark pickup truck had pulled into the parking lot between midnight and 02 o'clock. It would park in the far corner, away from the lights, and sit there for 20 to 30 minutes. The driver never got out, never interacted with anyone, just watched. Talon felt anger rising in him. The killer had been stalking Della, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment. And when she'd finally been vulnerable, driving alone on a dark highway, he'd struck. They copied the footage and drove back to the station. Agent Hale enhanced the images, trying to get a clear look at the truck and driver. The license plate was obscured, deliberately covered with mud or tape, but the truck's profile matched what they'd seen in other footage. Heavy-duty pickup, extended cab, equipment rack on the roof with that distinctive 3-light configuration. And on the rear bumper, barely visible in one frame, was the Desert Communications Network sticker. Same vehicle, Agent Hale confirmed. Same killer. At 13 o'clock, the warrant came through and they gained access to DCN's employee records. There were 43 current employees and 17 former employees who'd worked in the Four Corners region over the past 2 years. The FBI's data analysts began cross-referencing them against vehicle registrations, criminal records, and psychological profiles. By 15 o'clock, they had a short list of 5 names. 4 were quickly eliminated. Wrong vehicle type, solid alibis for the nights in question, or currently working out of state. That left 1 name, Kaysen Ryle. Kaysen Ryle, age 42, had worked for DCN for 7 years as a field technician, installing and maintaining communication towers throughout Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. His personnel file showed solid technical skills but poor interpersonal relationships. He'd been written up multiple times for conflicts with coworkers and customers. 13 months ago, he'd been fired after a confrontation with a supervisor that had nearly turned violent. Since then, he'd been working as an independent contractor, still doing similar work but on a freelance basis. Vehicle registration showed he owned a 2019 Dodge Ram 2500 dark blue with a custom equipment rack. The address on file was a P.O. box in Farmington. That's him, Marvin said with certainty. Agent Hale wasn't ready to commit yet. He fits the profile, but we need more before we move. If we spook him now and he runs, we might never catch him. She put out a bolo for Kaysen's truck, but specified that officers should observe only, not approach. We need to find where he's operating from. His actual residence, not just a P.O. box. Once we have that, we can surveil and build a case. Agent Nez started pulling utility records, cell phone records, anything that might give them Kaysen's real location. While they waited for that data, Talon went back through all the evidence with fresh eyes, now knowing who they were likely looking for. He pulled up Kaysen Ryle's DMV photo. Caucasian male, 6'3", 240 pounds, brown hair, blue eyes, thick beard, weathered face, eyes that looked through the camera rather than at it. Talon studied those eyes. They were empty, cold, the eyes of someone who'd disconnected from humanity. He'd seen that look before, in suspects who'd done terrible things and felt nothing about it. Agent Nez got a hit on cell tower data. Kaysen's phone had been pinging off towers in a specific pattern over the past 6 months. The data showed he spent most of his time in a rural area about 30 miles west of Farmington, near an area called Beastie Badlands. There were no residential addresses in that area, just miles of remote wilderness. Could be living off-grid, Agent Nez suggested. A lot of people out there do that. Park a trailer on public land, run generators for power, stay off the radar. Agent Hale pulled up satellite imagery of the area. The Badlands were a maze of eroded rock formations, hoodoos, and hills of banded stone. Perfect place to hide. They organized a reconnaissance mission for the following morning. A team would go into the Badlands, locate Kaysen's camp if possible, and establish surveillance. The goal was to catch him with evidence: the truck, the equipment, ideally even Della or her remains. But they had to be careful. Kaysen had proven himself technically sophisticated and paranoid. If he had cameras set up, if he spotted the surveillance team, he'd disappear. Agent Hale brought in additional resources: FBI tactical team, additional tribal police officers, a mobile command center. This was turning into a major operation. That night, Talon couldn't sleep again. He kept thinking about Della, wondering if she was still alive somewhere, trapped and terrified. The timeline suggested she'd been taken less than 12 hours ago. The pattern with Pike suggested the killer's ritual took at least 42 minutes, possibly longer. But then what? Did he keep victims alive for a while before killing them? Or did he work quickly and move on? There was no way to know without more data. And every hour that passed was another hour Della was in the hands of a monster. At 04 o'clock, Talon gave up on sleep and went to the station. Marvin was already there, doing the same thing, reviewing case files, looking for any detail they might have missed. They sat together in the quiet station, coffee growing cold in their cups, watching the clock. At 05:30, the operation briefing began. Agents, officers, and technicians gathered in the conference room. Agent Hale laid out the plan. We go in quiet, establish surveillance from a distance. If we locate Kaysen's camp, we watch and wait. If he has Della, if she's alive, we'll know. If she's not, we document evidence and then we move in with warrants and tactical support. Questions? Officer Rowan asked the obvious one. What if we get there and he's in the middle of killing her? Do we intervene? Agent Hale's expression was firm. If there's an immediate threat to life, we act. Otherwise, we follow protocol. I want this to stick in court. No mistakes, no chances for this monster to walk on technicalities. They understood. Everyone wanted to rush in and save Della, but they also wanted to make sure Kaysen Ryle spent the rest of his life in prison. At 06 Aqua, the convoy left Kayenta. 8 vehicles, 23 personnel, all headed into the Badlands. The drive took 90 minutes, the last 30 on dirt roads that barely qualified as roads. The landscape was otherworldly. Layers of stone in shades of gray and purple and rust, eroded into fantastic shapes by millions of years of wind and water. It was beautiful and alien, a place that felt disconnected from the modern world. Perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. The convoy stopped 2 miles from the area where Kaysen's phone signal had been strongest. From here, they would proceed on foot, spreading out in a search pattern, looking for any signs of human habitation. Talon was paired with Agent Nez and Officer Rowan. They moved quietly through the Badlands, using the rock formations for cover, scanning the terrain ahead. The morning air was cool, but would heat up fast once the sun rose higher. They'd been searching for almost an hour when Agent Nez raised his hand in a stop signal. He pointed ahead to a shallow valley between 2 ridges of stone. Down in that valley, partially hidden by a rocky outcrop, was a vehicle. The dark blue Dodge Ram, custom light bar on the roof, Desert Communications Network sticker on the bumper. They'd found him. Agent Nez radioed the location to the command center. Agent Hale's voice came back crisp and clear. Hold position, do not approach. We're bringing everyone to your location. They crouched behind rocks and waited, watching the valley below. Near the truck was a large canvas tent, weathered and dust-covered. Solar panels were set up nearby, feeding power to something inside. There was a portable generator, too, currently silent. And beyond the tent, that same metal frame they'd found at Pike's burn site, though this one was disassembled and stacked against the rocks. As they watched, a figure emerged from the tent. Tall, heavily built, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap. Even from a distance, Talon recognized him from the DMV photo. Kaysen Ryle. He moved with purpose, walking to the truck and pulling something from the bed. It looked like a fuel can. He carried it to the generator and began refueling it. The normalcy of the action was surreal. Here was a man who'd kidnapped and murdered multiple people, casually going about routine camp maintenance like he was just another person living off the grid. More officers arrived, taking up positions around the valley's rim. They had Kaysen surrounded, but they still needed to know if Della was down there, and if so, whether she was alive. Agent Hale set up her command post and sent a small drone equipped with thermal cameras to overfly the camp. The drone's footage appeared on tablets carried by the team. It showed 2 heat signatures in the valley, one moving around outside, that was Kaysen. The other was inside the tent, stationary. Someone's in the tent, Agent Hale confirmed, but I can't tell if they're alive or dead. The decision was made. They would move in. FBI tactical team would approach from 3 sides with tribal police covering the 4th side as backup. The goal was to take Kaysen alive, preferably without a firefight that might endanger whoever was in the tent. At Agent Hale's signal, the teams moved. They descended into the valley quickly but quietly, weapons drawn, spreading out to cover all angles. Kaysen didn't notice them at first. He was bent over the generator, adjusting something. Then one of the tactical agent's boot knocked a loose stone, and the sound echoed across the valley. Kaysen's head snapped up. He saw the armed officers converging on him, and for a moment, he froze. Then he ran, not toward his truck or any escape route, but toward the tent. Agent Hale's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Federal agents, stop where you are! Hands in the air!" Kaysen ignored the command and disappeared into the tent. Agents moved to surround it, cutting off any escape. "Kaysen Ryle, come out of the tent with your hands up. There's nowhere to go." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Kaysen emerged, but he wasn't alone. He was dragging someone with him, a woman, middle-aged, her hands bound, tape over her mouth. Della. She was alive. Kaysen held a knife to her throat, backing away from the tent, using her as a shield. "Stay back," he shouted. His voice was rough, strained. "I'll kill her. I'll do it right now." Agent Hale kept her weapon trained on him. "Nobody wants that, Kaysen. Let her go. Let her go and we can talk." Kaysen laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Talk? You're going to arrest me, execute me. I know how this works." Talon had moved into position about 30 yards from Kaysen, partially hidden by a rock formation. He had a clear shot, but taking it while Kaysen had that knife at Della's throat was too risky. He kept his weapon trained on Kaysen's head, waiting for an opening. Agent Hale continued negotiating. "Nobody's executing anybody. You let Della go, you drop the knife, and we can work this out. You're not helping yourself right now." Kaysen's eyes darted around, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. 20 armed officers surrounded him. He was trapped and he knew it. "You don't understand," Kaysen said, his voice taking on a strange, almost pleading quality. "I had to do it. The signals, they told me. The frequencies, they're in everything. The radios, the towers. They're calling out. Someone has to answer. Someone has to complete the circuit." He was rambling, his grip on Della tightening. She whimpered behind the tape, her eyes wide with terror. Talon could see blood on her shirt, bruises on her face. She'd been through hell, and now she was seconds away from dying if they didn't do something. Agent Nez spoke up, his voice calm and measured. "The signals, Kaysen. Tell us about the signals. Help us understand." Kaysen turned toward the sound of Agent Nez's voice, his attention shifting just slightly. The knife moved away from Della's throat by maybe an inch. Agent Nez continued. "You worked with communication towers. You know the frequencies better than anyone. What are they telling you?" Kaysen's expression changed, becoming almost eager. "They're building something. A network. Not just for phones and data, something else. Something bigger. I can hear it in the static, see it in the interference patterns, and I'm part of it now. Every mark I leave, every circuit I complete, I'm helping build it." While Kaysen was distracted talking to Agent Nez, Della did something brave. She suddenly dropped her weight, pulling down and to the side, trying to break free from Kaysen's grip. The movement caught him by surprise, and for a split second, the knife moved away from her throat. That was all Talon needed. He squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the Badlands like thunder. Kaysen dropped, the knife falling from his hand. Della collapsed to the ground. Officers rushed forward, securing the scene, checking on Della, kicking the knife away from Kaysen's reach. Talon moved in with his weapon still raised, clearing the area around Kaysen. The shot had been clean. Center mass, right where he'd aimed. Kaysen was down but still breathing, blood spreading across his shirt. Paramedics rushed forward, working to stabilize him. Agent Hale cut the tape from Della's wrists and mouth, wrapping her in a thermal blanket. "You're safe now. You're safe. We've got you." Della sobbed, her whole body shaking. She'd been bound and captive for hours, terrorized by a madman, and had come within seconds of death. But she'd survived. Kaysen was loaded onto a stretcher and taken to a waiting helicopter for medevac to Farmington Medical Center. The wound was serious but survivable. He'd face trial, assuming he recovered. Talon watched the helicopter lift off, carrying the killer away, and felt no sense of satisfaction. They'd stopped Kaysen, saved Della, but they hadn't saved Ephraim Pike or any of the others who'd come before. And the things Kaysen had said, about signals, networks, completing circuits, those words echoed in Talon's mind with an unsettling resonance. The forensics team moved through Kaysen's camp methodically. Inside the tent, they found evidence that confirmed their worst fears. Personal items from all the victims. Pike's wallet, Sarah Kendrick's necklace, Raymond Cross's wedding ring, trophies kept to relive the kills. They found notebooks, too, filled with sketches of that angular symbol and pages of rambling text about frequencies and networks and transformation. The writings were disjointed, possibly the product of a deteriorating mind, but they painted a picture of someone who'd constructed an elaborate delusional system to justify his murders. In a plastic container near the disassembled metal frame, they found ashes. Human ashes, mixed together, impossible to separate into individual victims. Maris collected samples, but she already knew what DNA analysis would show. These were the remains of Pike and the others, all mixed together into a gray powder that Kaysen had been using to draw his symbols. The realization made Talon feel sick. The killer had reduced human beings to ash and paint, transforming them into marks on walls and roofs and desert sand. Agent Hale stood with Talon at the edge of the camp, looking out over the Badlands. "You did good work," she said quietly. "All of you did. Without your investigation, we never would have found this place in time to save Della." Talon nodded, but he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. What he said about signals and networks, you think that was just delusion? Or was there something more to it? Agent Hale considered the question. our profilers will analyze everything he wrote, everything he said, try to understand his psychology, but sometimes there is no deeper meaning. Sometimes people just break, and the reasons they give are just rationalizations. The sun was fully up now, heating the Badlands, turning the stone formations into waves of color. Talon thought about Ephraim Pike, driving his rig down a dark highway, seeing those headlights in his mirror. He thought about Della, running that same route weeks later, making that desperate 911 call. How many other truckers had driven past Kayson's camp without knowing what was happening down in this valley? How many had seen that dark blue pickup and thought nothing of it? The randomness of it all, the chance encounters that separated victims from survivors, weighed heavily on him. Back in Kayenta that evening, the team gathered for a debriefing. Kayson Ryle was in stable condition, under guard at the hospital, facing multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, and a host of other charges. Della was reunited with her employees and family, physically battered but alive. The investigation would continue for weeks, processing all the evidence from Kayson's camp, trying to definitively link him to all the victims. But the immediate threat was over. The killer was caught. Agent Hale thanked everyone for their work and coordination, then released the team to get some much-needed rest. Talon drove home as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His house looked the same as always, but he knew he'd never feel quite safe there again. Not after the break-in, the photograph, the symbol on his roof. Those violations of his personal space had changed something fundamental. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, turning on every light in the house. The symbol had been cleaned off the roof, but he could still picture it perfectly, those angular lines radiating from a central point. He made himself dinner, but barely tasted it. His mind kept replaying the moment of the shot, seeing Kayson drop, hearing Della's sobs. It had been a righteous shoot. Kayson had been holding a hostage at knife point, posed an immediate threat, gave them no choice. Talon had done everything by the book, but taking a life, even a life like Kayson Ryle's, left a mark. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in his living room, lights all on, trying to quiet his thoughts. His phone buzzed, a text from Marvin. "You okay?" Talon typed back, "Yeah, you, Marvin. Getting there. Good work today." Talon, "You too. Get some rest." But rest felt far away. Talon stayed up late into the night, going over the case in his mind, thinking about what Kayson had said. The signals, the network, completing circuits. It was the ramblings of a deranged mind, surely. But there had been something in Kayson's eyes when he'd said it, a conviction that went beyond simple delusion. He'd believed it utterly. 3 days later, Talon was back at the station, catching up on paperwork. Kayson Ryle had been formally charged and was being held without bail. His attorney had already started building an insanity defense, arguing that Kayson's mental state made him unfit to stand trial. The prosecution was fighting it, bringing in psychiatrists who'd evaluated him and declared him competent. It would be months, maybe years, before this case went to trial. But at least it was moving forward. At least there would be justice for the victims. Agent Hale and Agent Nez stopped by before heading back to Albuquerque. They'd been coordinating with other field offices, checking for similar cases in other states. So far, nothing that matched Kayson's specific M.O. "Looks like he was working alone," Agent Hale said, "operating in this specific geographic area. We're confident we've identified all his victims. 4 confirmed, possibly a 5th we're still investigating from 2022. But no other cases that fit the pattern." That was something, at least. The nightmare was contained. Before they left, Agent Nez pulled Talon aside. I looked into what Kaysen was saying about the signals and networks, just out of curiosity. Talon felt a chill, and Agent Nez shrugged. Nothing concrete, but I did find something interesting. Desert Communications Network, the company Kaysen worked for. They specialized in installing communication infrastructure in remote areas, towers for cell service, emergency communications, that kind of thing. And in the past 2 years, they'd installed a lot of equipment in this region. New towers, relay stations all across the Badlands and desert areas where the victims disappeared. Talon processed this. You're saying there's a connection between the communication towers and the murders? Agent Nez shook his head. I'm not saying anything, just noting the coincidence. Kaysen had intimate knowledge of where these towers were, what frequencies they operated on, where the coverage gaps were. He knew exactly where to take his victims, places where cell phones wouldn't work, where calls couldn't get through. He used his professional knowledge to facilitate his crimes. That made sense. It was logical, but something about it still bothered Talon. What about the symbol? Talon asked. Any progress on identifying what it means? Agent Nez pulled out his tablet and showed Talon some images. We ran it through every database we have. Gang signs, occult symbols, religious iconography, military insignia. Nothing matched exactly, but we found something close. There's an obscure branch of signal theory, barely studied anymore, that uses geometric patterns to represent interference patterns and wave harmonics. The symbol Kaysen used is similar to some of those patterns, modified, but similar. Talon stared at the images. So it wasn't just random. He was basing it on something real. Agent Nez nodded. Possibly. Or maybe he just saw those patterns in his technical manuals and his deteriorating mind latched onto them, gave them significance they don't actually have. After the FBI agents left, Talon sat at his desk and pulled up information on signal theory and interference patterns. He wasn't a technical person. That had been Kaysen's area of expertise, but he could grasp the basics. Radio waves, cellular signals, all these invisible frequencies filling the air, bouncing off surfaces, creating complex patterns of reinforcement and cancellation. Kaysen had worked with this technology for years, had been exposed to it constantly. Had it somehow affected his mind? Or had his existing mental illness just fixated on it as a framework for his delusions? Talon thought about the burn sites, the extreme temperatures required to cremate human remains. He thought about Kaysen's notebooks, filled with calculations and frequency diagrams. He thought about the surveillance cameras Kaysen had planted, watching his own crime scenes, watching the police investigate. There was an intelligence to it all, a methodical quality that suggested more than just madness. Kaysen had been organized, careful, technically sophisticated, right up until the end, when he'd been cornered and desperate. Weeks passed. The case moved through the legal system. Kaysen was declared competent to stand trial. Evidence was prepared, witnesses interviewed, legal motions filed. Talon returned to regular patrol duties, but the case stayed with him. Sometimes, driving the dark highways at night, he'd see a semi-truck ahead and feel a twist of anxiety. Sometimes he'd notice a dark pickup in his rearview mirror, and his hand would drift to his weapon before he reminded himself it was over. The killer was caught. The highways were safe again. One evening, 2 months after Kaysen's arrest, Talon drove out to the mesa where they'd found the first burn site. He wasn't sure why, maybe just to see it again, to confirm it was real and not some nightmare. The site had been processed thoroughly by forensics, then left to the elements. Wind and sand had already started covering the scarred ground. In a few years, there'd be no trace of what had happened here. The desert would reclaim it, hide it, forget it. Talon stood where the metal frame had been, where Ephraim Pike had spent his final moments. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant reds and golds. It was beautiful out here, peaceful in a way that seemed to mock the horror that had occurred. He thought about Pike's CB radio message, still looping, trapped in some electronic purgatory. He thought about Kaysen's words, completing the circuit. He thought about all those communication towers scattered across the desert, silent sentinels broadcasting signals that most people never thought about. His phone buzzed. A text from Maris. DNA results came back on the ashes from Kaysen's camp. Confirmed match for all 4 victims. Also found traces of 3 additional individuals we haven't identified yet. Looks like there were more victims than we thought. Talon stared at the message. More victims. People who'd disappeared years ago, before anyone had connected the cases, before anyone had even realized there was a pattern. How many people had Kaysen killed? How long had this been going on? The questions multiplied, but the answers were locked in Kaysen's damaged mind. Talon drove back to Kayenta as darkness fell. The highway stretched out before him, illuminated by his headlights, disappearing into shadow. Somewhere out there, families were waiting for word about missing loved ones, not knowing that their answers lay in a container of mixed ash in an evidence locker. Somewhere out there, other predators were hunting, following their own twisted patterns, and it was up to people like Talon to stop them. The work never ended. The highway was never truly safe. At home, Talon sat in his living room and wrote out his final report on the case. He documented everything: the investigation, the evidence, the arrest, but he left out his private thoughts, the unease that still lingered. Those weren't appropriate for an official report. Those were his alone to carry. When he finished, he emailed the report to Marvin and closed his laptop. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling his windows, carrying sand across the desert. Somewhere in that wind, he thought he could hear a faint hum, like distant machinery, like frequencies bouncing through the air, completing invisible circuits. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was nothing, just wind and imagination. Kaysen Ryle was in custody. The case was closed. The signals were just signals, electromagnetic waves with no consciousness, no intent, no meaning beyond what human minds projected onto them. Talon turned off the lights and went to bed, though he knew sleep would be long in coming. And tomorrow he'd be back on patrol, watching the highways, protecting the travelers, waiting for the next call that would pull him into darkness. Because that was the job. That was the calling. And despite everything, despite the horror and doubt, he wouldn't want to do anything else. Officer Kestrel Atsidi turned her patrol unit onto the dirt road just as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The call had come in at 0447, suspicious vehicle near a school bus route. Caller reporting a dark panel van parked on County Road 262 for several hours. Not unusual by itself, but the location made it worth checking out. The road ran close to Combe Ridge, an area where kids waited for the morning school bus, and any vehicle lingering near a school route got immediate attention. Kestrel had been running night patrol out of the Montezuma Creek station for 3 years, and she'd learned to trust her instincts. Something about this call felt off. The dirt road was rough, washboard surface that rattled her unit's suspension. Dust rose behind her in the pre-dawn darkness, visible in her rearview mirror as a pale cloud. She'd radioed dispatch before leaving the highway, letting them know her location and ETA. Dispatcher Maylene Sosi had acknowledged, her voice calm and professional as always. 10-4, Unit 7. Nearest backup is 15 minutes out if you need it. Kestrel hoped she wouldn't, but she kept her radio close. The road wound through scrubland dotted with juniper trees, climbing gradually toward the ridge. In daylight, the view would be spectacular. red rock cliffs rising hundreds of feet, layer upon layer of ancient stone. But now, in the darkness before dawn, it just looked ominous. At mile marker 3, Kestrel's headlights caught it. A white panel van pulled off onto the shoulder, facing away from the main road. No lights, no signs of life. She slowed her approach, running the plate through her computer. The van came back registered to a rental company out of Farmington. Rented 4 days ago to a name she didn't recognize. Vance Reddick, Arizona driver's license. She ran his name through the system. Clean record, no warrants, 38 years old. But that didn't mean much. Plenty of criminals had clean records right up until they didn't. Kestrel pulled her unit up behind the van, positioning it at an angle that would give her cover if needed, and hit her spotlight. The van's interior lit up through the rear windows. Empty, as far as she could see. No movement, no reaction to the light. Kestrel keyed her radio. "Dispatch, Unit 7, I'm 1097 at County Road 262, Mile 3, white panel van, Arizona rental plates." She read off the plate number. "Vehicle appears unoccupied. I'm approaching on foot." Maylene's voice came back. "Copy that, Unit 7. Backup en route. ETA 12 minutes. Kestrel stepped out of her unit, hand resting on her sidearm, flashlight in her left hand. The morning air was cold, that deep chill that came right before sunrise. Her breath formed small clouds as she approached the van. She circled around to the driver's side, checking the windows. Front seats were empty. No keys in the ignition, no personal items visible. The back of the van had no windows, just solid metal panels. Kestrel tried the driver's door. Locked. She walked around to the passenger side, also locked. The rear doors were secured with a padlock, industrial grade from the look of it. Not standard for a rental van. Someone had added that lock themselves. Kestrel felt that tingle at the base of her skull, the one that said something was wrong here. She shone her flashlight on the ground around the van, looking for tracks, and found them immediately. Boot prints, multiple sets, leading away from the van toward Comb Ridge. The tracks were fresh, pressed deep into the sandy soil. At least 3 different people, maybe 4, had walked from this van into the scrubland. Kestrel followed the tracks with her flashlight beam. They headed southeast toward a narrow canyon entrance she knew was about a 1/4 mile away. Local kids sometimes hiked there, but not at 4 in the morning. Not in the dark. She returned to her unit and grabbed her rifle from the rack. Whatever was going on here, she wasn't going in unprepared. She radioed dispatch again. "Unit 7, I've got multiple sets of tracks leading from the van toward Comb Ridge. Requesting additional backup and possibly K9 unit." Maylene acknowledged. "Copy. Sergeant Yazzie is en route, ETA 10 minutes. K9 unit is being notified." Kestrel started following the tracks, moving carefully, rifle at low ready. The terrain was rough, scattered with rocks and tough desert plants that caught at her uniform. The tracks were clear enough to follow even in the dim light, a trail of disturbed sand and broken vegetation. Whoever had made these tracks hadn't been trying to hide them. As she got closer to the canyon entrance, Kestrel heard something. Faint, distant, voices maybe, or just wind echoing off the rock walls. She stopped, listening. There it was again, definitely voices, male, speaking in low tones. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, businesslike. Kestrel moved forward more cautiously now, using the scrub brush for cover. The canyon entrance was a narrow slot between 2 towering walls of sandstone, maybe 15 feet wide at the opening. The tracks led straight into it. She positioned herself behind a large boulder and keyed her radio, speaking quietly. "Dispatch, I've got voices coming from the canyon. Multiple males. I'm holding position until backup arrives." Before Maylene could respond, Kestrel saw movement. 2 men emerged from the canyon entrance, maybe 50 yards away. They were carrying something between them, a large duffel bag or bundle, dark-colored and heavy from the way they were straining. They walked quickly to the van, set the bundle down, and one of them produced keys. He unlocked the padlock on the rear doors, and they swung them open. Even from a distance, Kestrel could see the van's cargo area wasn't empty. There were more bundles inside, stacked along the sides. The men loaded the bundle they'd brought, secured it with bungee cords, and closed the doors again. Kestrel watched them through her scope, getting descriptions. First man, Caucasian, maybe 6 feet, lean build, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap. Second man, shorter, stockier, similar clothing. Both looked like they were in their 30s or 40s. As they turned back towards the canyon, a third man emerged. This one was different. Older, gray hair, wearing what looked like a hiking vest with multiple pockets. He was carrying a clipboard and checking it with a small flashlight. He said something to the other 2 men, gesturing back toward the canyon, then toward the van. The body language was clear. He was in charge. Sergeant Corbin Yazzie voice came over the radio, quiet but clear. Unit 7, this is Sergeant Yazzie. I'm approaching your location from the north. What's your position? Kestrel responded, keeping her voice low. Behind the large boulder cluster, 50 yards northwest of the van. I've got eyes on 3 suspects. They're loading cargo into the van from the canyon. Recommend we wait for additional backup before approaching. Corbin acknowledged. Copy that. I'm moving into position. K9 unit is 5 minutes out. Kestrel kept watching. The 3 men had gone back into the canyon. She could hear more voices now, echoing off the stone walls. How many people were in there? And what were they doing? The bundles they'd loaded into the van, they were too large and awkwardly shaped to be standard cargo. Drugs, maybe? But why bring them out here to this remote canyon to load them? Why not just meet somewhere closer to a road? None of it made sense. She scanned the area through her scope, looking for more suspects, more vehicles. Nothing. Just the white van sitting alone on the dirt road. Movement to her right. Sergeant Yazzie appeared, moving low and fast, taking cover behind a rock formation about 20 yards from her position. He was in his late 40s, solidly built, with 25 years of experience that showed in the way he moved. He hand-signaled to Kestrel, hold position. She acknowledged. They waited in the growing light, watching the canyon entrance. Dawn was coming fast now, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to a pale orange at the horizon. In another 15 minutes, it would be full daylight. 2 more men emerged from the canyon carrying another bundle. They looked exhausted, stumbling slightly as they walked to the van. The older man with the clipboard followed them, checking his watch, clearly agitated. He was saying something to them, his tone sharp even though Kestrel couldn't make out the words. The 2 men loaded their bundle into the van with less care than before, practically throwing it in. One of them said something back to the older man, his posture defensive. An argument was brewing. The older man pointed back toward the canyon emphatically, then toward his watch. Whatever schedule they were on, they were running behind. Kestrel's radio crackled softly. Unit 7, K9 unit is on scene, holding at the county road. Corbin responded before Kestrel could. Copy. Have them stand by. We've got multiple suspects loading cargo from canyon into panel van, preparing to intercept. He hand-signaled to Kestrel, move closer. They advanced together, using the terrain for cover, closing the distance to 30 yards. Close enough now that Kestrel could hear fragments of conversation. The older man told you we needed to be done by sunrise. Exposure. Can't afford. One of the younger men. Heavier than you said. Need more time. A 4th man emerged from the canyon, and Kestrel's stomach dropped. This man was different. He was helping someone else walk, supporting most of their weight. The second person was smaller, stumbling, hands bound in front of them. Even from 30 yards away, Kestrel could see they were in distress. The man helping them, forcing them, was Caucasian, muscular, wearing tactical-style clothing. The person he was controlling was young, possibly a teenager, wearing what looked like torn clothing. Kestrel and Corbin exchanged glances. This wasn't smuggling. This was human trafficking. Corbin keyed his radio. "All units, we have visual confirmation of human trafficking in progress. Suspects are armed and dangerous. We are moving to intercept. K9 unit. Block the access road. Do not let that van leave." The K9 officer acknowledged. Corbin stood up, rifle raised, and his voice boomed across the scrubland. "Navajo tribal police. Nobody move. Hands in the air where we can see them." For a frozen moment, nobody reacted. The men at the van stood motionless, like someone had hit pause on a video. Then everything happened at once. The muscular man dropped the person he'd been holding and ran back toward the canyon. The older man with the clipboard dove behind the van, reaching for something at his waist. The two men who'd been loading cargo scattered in opposite directions. Kestrel tracked the muscular man through her scope. "Runner, heading back into canyon." Corbin was already moving toward the van, shouting commands. "Drop your weapons! Get on the ground now!" Kestrel sprinted forward, angling to intercept the runner before he could disappear into the canyon. She reached the person who'd been dropped, definitely a young woman, probably late teens, terrified and shaking. "It's okay," Kestrel said quickly, kneeling beside her but keeping her weapon up. "You're safe. We're police." The woman's eyes were wide, unfocused. She'd been drugged. Kestrel pulled out a knife and cut the zip ties binding her wrists. "Stay down, stay here, help is coming." Then she was up and running again, following the muscular man into the canyon. The canyon walls closed around her, cutting off most of the dawn light. Shadows stretched across the sandy floor, broken by bands of deep shadow where the walls curved. Kestrel moved carefully, weapon raised, listening for sounds of movement ahead. The canyon twisted and turned, sometimes widening to 20 feet, sometimes narrowing to barely shoulder width. Perfect place for an ambush. She heard scrambling ahead, feet on stone, echoing off the walls. She picked up her pace, rounding a sharp bend. The muscular man was there, 30 feet ahead, climbing up a tumbled section of rock that formed a natural ramp up the canyon wall. Kestrel shouted, "Stop! Police!" He didn't stop. He reached the top of the rock pile and kept climbing, finding handholds in the sandstone. Kestrel reached the base of the rocks and started climbing after him. The stone was rough under her hands. Good grip, but the angle was steep. She had to sling her rifle to climb effectively. Above her, the man had reached a narrow ledge about 20 feet up and was scrambling along it, trying to find a way higher. Kestrel pulled herself up onto the same ledge. It was maybe 2 feet wide, pressed against the canyon wall, with a 30-foot drop to the canyon floor below. Not fatal, probably, but enough to break bones. The man had stopped climbing. He was trapped. The cliff face above the ledge was sheer, unclimbable without equipment. He turned to face her, breathing hard, cornered. Kestrel brought her rifle up. "It's over. Come down slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." The man's eyes darted around, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. For a moment, Kestrel thought he was going to jump. Then his shoulders slumped. Okay, I'm coming down." His hands went up, empty, and he started moving back along the ledge toward her. Kestrel kept her rifle trained on him, backing up carefully to give him room to descend. He climbed down the rock pile with her following, and by the time they reached the canyon floor, she could hear voices echoing from the entrance. More officers arriving. The man got down on his knees without being told, hands behind his head. Kestrel cuffed him quickly, professionally. "You have the right to remain silent." She recited the Miranda warning as she checked him for weapons. Found a knife in his belt, a cell phone, keys, but no gun. She walked him back to the canyon entrance. The scene had been secured. 3 suspects on the ground in cuffs. The fourth, the older man with the clipboard, sitting against the van with Sergeant Yazzie standing over him. The K-9 unit had blocked the access road with their vehicle. More patrol units were arriving, lights flashing in the growing daylight. And standing near Corbin, wrapped in a blanket, was the young woman Kestrel had found. She was talking to a female officer, her voice barely audible. Another patrol unit pulled up, and 2 EMTs jumped out, heading straight for the woman. Kestrel handed off her prisoner to another officer and walked over to Corbin. He was questioning the older man who was refusing to answer, just staring at the ground. Corbin looked up as Kestrel approached. "Good work, you okay?" She nodded. "Fine. What have we got?" Corbin gestured toward the van. "They'd loaded 6 large bundles before we moved in. Want to guess what's in them?" Kestrel's jaw tightened. "More victims?" Corbin nodded grimly. "We opened them carefully. 6 more people, all young, all drugged. EMTs are checking them now. All alive, thank God." Kestrel looked at the canyon entrance. "How many more in there?" Corbin shook his head. "We're about to find out. I've got officers doing a sweep now." As if on cue, 2 officers emerged from the canyon, supporting another person between them, a young man, early 20s, barely conscious. Behind them came more officers and more victims. By the time the sweep was complete, they'd found 12 people in total, held in a makeshift camp about a quarter mile into the canyon. All of them were bound, drugged, and in various states of distress. All of them had been destined for transport in that van, headed God knows where. The EMTs were overwhelmed, calling for additional ambulances from Cortez and Blanding. Kestrel helped organize the victims, getting them water, blankets, making sure they were stable until transport arrived. Most were too drugged to talk coherently, but a few were starting to come around. One young woman, maybe 19, grabbed Kestrel's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Thank you for finding us." Kestrel squeezed her hand gently. "You're safe now. It's over." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. By full daylight, the scene had transformed into a major operation. The FBI had been notified and agents were en route from Albuquerque. Additional tribal police units had arrived, along with social services personnel to handle the victims. The canyon entrance was now a designated crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape. Kestrel stood near the van, watching the organized chaos, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from her system. She'd been running on it for the past 2 hours, and now the crash was coming. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted a bottle of water from another officer. Sergeant Yazzie walked over, his expression serious but satisfied. "Good eyes, Kestrel. If you hadn't responded to that call, if you hadn't pushed to investigate, those 12 people would be gone. Disappeared into whatever network these bastards are running." Kestrel nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The reality of what they'd prevented was starting to sink in. 12 human beings, some barely adults, bound for slavery or worse. The young woman who'd thanked her was being loaded into an ambulance now, an EMT checking her vitals. She caught Kestrel's eye and gave a weak wave. Kestrel waved back. The 4 suspects had been separated and placed in different patrol units, ready for transport to the detention facility in Shiprock. None of them were talking. All had immediately lawyered up. But they didn't need confessions. The evidence was overwhelming. The van full of drugged victims, the camp in the canyon with restraints and supplies, cell phones with incriminating text messages and contacts. This case was solid. Corbin walked over to Kestrel, holding an evidence bag. Inside was a map, folded and worn, with markings in red ink. Found this in the older suspect's pocket, the one with the clipboard. Take a look. Kestrel examined the map through the clear plastic. It showed the Four Corners region, with multiple locations marked. Some were crossed out, some circled, some had dates written next to them. The location where they were now standing had a circle and yesterday's date. Another location, about 40 miles west near Bears Ears, had today's date. Kestrel looked up at Corbin. They've got another operation scheduled for today. Corbin nodded grimly. That's what I'm thinking. We need to get this to the FBI as soon as they arrive. If we move fast, we might be able to hit multiple locations before they realize this site was compromised. 2 black SUVs pulled up, and FBI agents emerged. The lead agent was a woman in her early 40s, ID badge identifying her as Special Agent Linda Marsh. She was accompanied by 3 other agents, all business in their dark suits and tactical vests. Agent Marsh surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, then approached Corbin. Sergeant Yazzie, I'm Agent Marsh, FBI Human Trafficking Task Force. Brief me. Corbin laid it out efficiently. The initial call, Kestrel's investigation, the rescue of 12 victims, the arrest of 4 suspects. He showed her the map. Agent Marsh studied the map carefully. We've been tracking indicators of trafficking activity in this region for 6 months. Multiple missing persons reports that didn't fit standard patterns, witness reports of suspicious vehicles, but we couldn't pin down the operation. You just gave us the break we needed. She looked at Kestrel. You're the officer who responded to the initial call? Kestrel nodded. Yes, ma'am. Officer Kestrel Atsidi. Agent Marsh extended her hand. Good work, officer. Really good work. I'm going to need you to walk me through everything you saw, every detail. They spent the next hour going over the timeline. Kestrel described the van, the tracks, the voices from the canyon, the suspects loading cargo. She described the young woman she'd found, the runner she'd chased into the canyon, everything. Agent Marsh took extensive notes, asking clarifying questions, building a detailed picture of the operation. When Kestrel mentioned the bundles the suspects had been loading, Agent Marsh's expression darkened. They were packaging humans like cargo. That level of dehumanization suggests this network has been operating for a while. They're experienced, efficient. One of the other FBI agents approached, holding an evidence bag with one of the suspects' cell phones. Agent Marsh, we've got preliminary data from the phones. Multiple contacts with disposable numbers, encrypted messaging apps, but we're breaking through. Looks like there's a larger network coordinating these operations. This wasn't just 4 guys working alone. Agent Marsh nodded. Pull everything you can from those phones. I want call logs, message histories, GPS data, and coordinate with local law enforcement. We need to know about every person of interest these suspects contacted in the past month. Corbin pointed to the map again. What about this location marked for today? We have reason to believe there's another operation scheduled for this afternoon, near Bears Ears. Agent Marsh checked her watch. It was 8:30. If the marking on the map was accurate, the next operation would happen in less than 8 hours. We need to move on that immediately. Sergeant, can you spare officers for a joint operation? Corbin didn't hesitate. Absolutely, whatever you need. Agent Marsh started making calls, coordinating resources, bringing in additional FBI personnel, and requesting support from San Juan County Sheriff's Office. While the operation was being planned, Kestrel was assigned to help process the crime scene in the canyon. She grabbed her camera and evidence kit and headed back into the slot canyon with 2 other officers and a FBI forensic technician. The morning sun was higher now, sending shafts of golden light down into the narrow passage. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. Now, it just illuminated the horror of what had happened here. They followed the tracks deeper into the canyon, documenting everything. About a quarter-mile in, the canyon widened into a natural amphitheater, maybe 50 feet across, with walls rising on 3 sides. This was where the suspects had set up their temporary camp. Tarps were strung between rock outcroppings for shade. Sleeping bags and supplies were scattered around. And along one wall were the restraints, steel eye bolts drilled into the rock, with chains attached. This was where the victims had been held. Kestrel felt cold looking at it, imagining the terror those 12 people had experienced, chained in this remote canyon, waiting to be transported to some unknown fate. The FBI tech started photographing everything, collecting samples, documenting the scene with methodical precision. Kestrel walked the perimeter, looking for anything the suspects might have left behind. She found water bottles, food wrappers, cigarette butts, all potential DNA evidence. She found a backpack tucked behind a rock containing more zip ties, duct tape, syringes, and small bottles of what looked like sedatives. She bagged it all. Near the back of the amphitheater, partially hidden by a fallen boulder, she found something else. A notebook, spiral-bound, with a waterproof cover. Kestrel picked it up carefully, opening it to the first page. It was a log of some kind, with dates and numbers. Each entry had a date, a location code, a number of units, she assumed that meant victims, and a status, either delivered or pending. The entries went back 6 months. Kestrel's stomach turned as she counted them. 37 entries. 37 separate operations. If the numbers were accurate, over 200 people had been trafficked through this network. She called the FBI tech over. "You need to see this." The tech examined the notebook, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is a gold mine. We can cross-reference these dates and locations with missing persons reports, build a comprehensive picture of the network's operations." He bagged the notebook carefully. Agent Marsh needs to see this immediately. They finished processing the canyon scene and headed back to the entrance. The operation had grown larger. More FBI vehicles had arrived, along with a mobile command center. The map and notebook were laid out on a table inside the command center with Agent Marsh and her team analyzing them. Agent Marsh looked up as Kestrel entered. "This notebook changes everything. We're not looking at a small-time operation. This is organized, sophisticated, with multiple cells operating across state lines. The FBI's trafficking division is bringing in additional resources. We're going to dismantle this entire network." She pointed to the map. "This location near Bear's Ears. We have a team assembling now. We move in at 1400, right before the operation is scheduled to begin. We want to catch them in the act, just like you did here." She looked at Kestrel. "I want you on that team. You've proven you can handle yourself, and you know the terrain." Kestrel felt a rush of purpose. "Yes, ma'am, I'm ready." Corbin nodded his approval. The next few hours were spent planning the operation. Satellite imagery showed the Bear's Ears location was another remote canyon system, accessible by a rough 4-wheel drive trail. The suspects would likely use a similar setup: victims held in the canyon, vehicles nearby for transport. The plan was to position teams on multiple approach routes, then move in simultaneously to prevent anyone from escaping. They would have FBI, tribal police, and sheriff's deputies working together. At 12:30, the convoy left the Combe Ridge site. Kestrel rode with Corbin in his unit, following the FBI vehicles toward Bear's Ears. The landscape changed as they drove west, the red rock formations growing more dramatic, twisted spires and balanced rocks that looked like they defied gravity. The Bear's Ears themselves, twin buttes rising from the plateau, were visible on the horizon. The convoy turned onto the dirt trail at 13:15, driving slowly to minimize dust clouds that might alert the suspects. They stopped a mile from the target location and proceeded on foot. Kestrel was assigned to a team with Agent Marsh and 2 other officers. They approached from the south, moving through broken terrain that provided good cover. The canyon entrance came into view, similar to the Comb Ridge site, a narrow slot between rock walls. But this time, there was no panel van parked nearby, no visible vehicles at all. Agent Marsh hand-signaled the team to hold position. She radioed the other teams. Team 1 in position. Anyone have eyes on suspect vehicles? Negative responses came back from all teams. They waited, watching the canyon entrance. Minutes ticked by. 14 and came and went. No activity. Agent Marsh's expression grew concerned. Something's wrong. They should be here by now. She radioed the command center. We have no activity at target location. Requesting surveillance check. A pause, then, Agent Marsh, we're picking up fresh tire tracks on an alternate route, approximately 1 mile north of your position. Suspects may have changed locations. Agent Marsh swore quietly. They changed the plan. Move out, everyone. North route, double time. The teams converged on the new location, moving as quickly as they could over rough terrain. Kestrel's legs burned from the pace, but she kept up. They crested a low ridge and saw it. 2 vehicles parked in a shallow valley, a dark SUV and a pickup truck. Figures were moving around them, loading cargo into the truck bed. They were too late. The operation was already in progress. Agent Marsh didn't hesitate. All teams, move in. Go, go, go. They charged down the slope, weapons drawn, shouting commands. FBI, Navajo Tribal Police, freeze. The suspects reacted immediately, but not the way the officers expected. Instead of running or surrendering, they scattered toward pre-planned escape routes. 2 dove into the SUV and fired up the engine. 2 more ran toward the canyon on foot, and 1, a tall man with a shaved head, pulled a weapon and started firing. Bullets kicked up dirt near Kestrel's position. She dove behind a rock, bringing her rifle up. The tall man was advancing on another officer's position, firing steadily. Kestrel aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger. Her shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his weapon and went down. The SUV was moving now, bouncing across the rough ground, trying to reach the access trail. One of the FBI vehicles blocked its path, and the SUV swerved, nearly rolling. The driver overcorrected and the vehicle slammed into a rock formation, airbags deploying. FBI agents swarmed the vehicle, pulling the occupants out and cuffing them. The 2 runners had disappeared into the canyon. Corbin and 2 other officers went after them. Kestrel approached the wounded man carefully, kicking his weapon away. Stay down, don't move. He was clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers, but he was conscious. Agent Marsh checked the truck bed, pulling back a tarp. Her face went pale. We've got victims here. 4, maybe 5, all unconscious. EMTs who'd been staged nearby rushed forward. Kestrel helped them check the victims. All young, all drugged, all showing signs of prolonged restraint. They were alive, barely, but they'd been saved. From the canyon came shouts, then gunfire, 2 quick shots. Kestrel's heart jumped. A minute later, Corbin's voice came over the radio. 2 suspects in custody. 1 tried to fight, but we've got them. Canyon is secure. The scene was processed over the next several hours. 5 more victims recovered. 3 more suspects arrested. but the notebook from Combe Ridge had listed this operation as involving 8 units. That meant 3 people were still missing. Agent Marsh questioned the suspects aggressively, but none would talk. Where were the other 3 victims? Had they already been moved? Were they being held at another location? The uncertainty gnawed at Kestrel. They'd saved lives today, prevented multiple kidnappings, but somewhere out there, 3 people were still in the hands of this trafficking network. Back at the mobile command center, the FBI's tech team was making progress with the seized phones and computers. They'd identified multiple layers to the trafficking network: recruiters who lured or kidnapped victims, transporters who moved them between locations, and buyers at the end of the chain. The operation spanned at least 5 states, possibly more. Agent Marsh briefed the assembled law enforcement personnel. "We've dealt a significant blow to this network today, but we haven't destroyed it. There are more cells operating, more victims we haven't found yet. This investigation is just beginning." Kestrel listened to the briefing, feeling the weight of it. 12 people saved at Combe Ridge, 5 more at Bears Ears, 17 lives recovered from hell. But how many more were still out there? The notebook had mentioned over 200 victims over 6 months. Where had they all gone? Agent Marsh seemed to read her thoughts. "I know what you're thinking, Officer Atsidi. We can't save everyone all at once. But every person we do save, every suspect we take down, that's progress. That's justice being served." Kestrel nodded, but the cold feeling in her stomach remained. As evening approached, Kestrel was released to go off duty. She'd been working for nearly 16 hours straight, and Corbin ordered her to go home and get rest. "You did outstanding work today," he said. "But you're no good to anyone if you're exhausted. Go home. Sleep. We'll debrief tomorrow." Kestrel drove back to her small apartment in Montezuma Creek, her mind replaying the day's events. The young woman at Combe Ridge, the grateful look in her eyes, the runner she'd chased into the canyon, the firefight at Bears Ears, the victims lying unconscious in the truck bed. It all blurred together. At home, she tried to eat but had no appetite. She tried to watch TV but couldn't focus. Finally, she just sat on her couch in the dark, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed. A text from Corbin. "FBI is requesting you for continued work on this case. They were impressed. Interested?" Kestrel typed back, "Yes," because what else could she say? There were still victims out there, still predators hunting. The work wasn't done, not even close. She thought about the map from the suspect's pocket. All those marked locations. How many other remote canyons held secrets? How many other operations were scheduled that they didn't know about yet? She pulled up a map on her phone, looking at the terrain around Combe Ridge and Bears Ears. The area was vast, thousands of square miles of remote desert and canyon country. Perfect for hiding illegal operations. Perfect for making people disappear. And somewhere in that landscape, the trafficking network was regrouping, adjusting to the loss of 2 cells, planning their next move. Kestrel zoomed in on the map, studying the topography, looking for patterns. If she was running a trafficking operation, where would she set up next? What locations offered the right combination of remoteness and accessibility? Her eyes caught on something. A series of dirt roads and trails near Cedar Mesa, forming a rough network that connected to multiple highway access points. Remote enough to avoid casual observation, but with good escape routes if needed. She checked the suspect's map that had been photographed and sent to all the task force members. Cedar Mesa wasn't marked on it, but that didn't mean it wasn't being used. It just meant the suspects hadn't written it down. Kestrel made a note to mention it in tomorrow's debriefing. It was probably nothing, but her instincts said otherwise. At 22, her phone rang. It was Agent Marsh. "Officer Atsidi, sorry to call so late. We've had a breakthrough." One of the suspects from Bear's Ears started talking. He's low level, just a transporter, but he's given us information about the network's structure. There's a coordinator, someone who plans all the operations and manages logistics. Goes by the name Conductor. The suspect doesn't know his real identity, but he's met him twice. Described him as Caucasian, 50s, with a distinctive scar on his left hand. Kestrel's pulse quickened. That's good, right? We can start looking for him. Agent Marsh continued. Yes, but there's more. The suspect says the conductor is planning something big. A major transport operation, moving multiple shipments at once. He doesn't know when or where, just that it's coming soon, and it's supposed to be the network's biggest operation yet. Kestrel felt cold. How many victims? Agent Marsh's voice was grim. The suspect estimated 30 to 40 people, if that's accurate. And if we don't stop it, 30 to 40 people will disappear into slavery or worse. Kestrel stood up, pacing her small apartment. What do you need me to do? Right now? Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we're putting together a special task force to hunt for the conductor and stop this operation. I want you on it. You've proven you have good instincts, and you know this terrain better than most of my agents. We're going to need every advantage we can get. Kestrel agreed and hung up. Sleep seemed impossible now, but she forced herself to lie down. Her mind kept working, turning over the case, looking for patterns. The conductor, someone experienced enough to run a multi-state trafficking network, someone with resources, connections, knowledge of remote locations. Someone who'd been doing this long enough to get good at it. She thought about the notebook they'd found, with its meticulous records of operations going back 6 months. That suggested a detail-oriented person, someone who liked documentation and control. But it also suggested arrogance. Keeping records like that was risky. It meant the conductor believed he was untouchable, that no one could connect the dots and track him down. Kestrel smiled grimly in the dark. That arrogance would be his downfall. They had dots now. They just needed to connect them. She finally fell asleep around midnight, but her dreams were troubled. She kept seeing the young woman from Combe Ridge, kept hearing her whispered thank you. But in the dream, Kestrel couldn't save her. The woman kept slipping away, disappearing into shadows, and Kestrel would wake with a start, heart pounding. After the third time, she gave up on sleep and made coffee. It was 04:00, nearly time to get up anyway. She showered, dressed in her uniform, and drove to the station early. The investigation was waiting, and somewhere out there so were 30 to 40 people who needed to be saved. The task force assembled at 08:00 in a conference room at the FBI's temporary field office in Blanding. Kestrel arrived to find a dozen personnel already present: FBI agents, tribal police officers, San Juan County deputies, and representatives from ICE and Homeland Security. This had escalated beyond a local case. Agent Marsh stood at the front of the room beside a large digital screen displaying maps, photos, and data charts. She waited for everyone to settle, then began. Good morning. For those I haven't met yet, I'm Special Agent Linda Marsh, leading this task force. Our objective is to identify and apprehend the individual known as Conductor and prevent a large-scale trafficking operation believed to be imminent. She clicked through slides showing the evidence collected so far. The notebook with its entries spanning 6 months. The map with marked locations. Phone records showing a web of contacts and communications. Our analysis indicates the conductor operates as a central coordinator. He doesn't participate directly in kidnappings or transport. He plans operations, assigns personnel, manages logistics. He's insulated himself with multiple layers of operatives, which is why we haven't identified him yet. But he's made mistakes, and we're going to exploit them. She brought up a photo of a partial fingerprint recovered from the notebook. This print doesn't match any of our arrested suspects. It's our best lead on the conductor himself. The FBI's technical analyst, a young man named Agent Torres, took over. We've been analyzing communication patterns from the seized phones. The conductor uses encrypted messaging apps and changes numbers frequently, but we've identified his patterns. He always makes contact at specific times, 02 and 2, 09 and quote, and 19 at, using a numbered code system to reference locations and operations. By cross-referencing the codes with the notebook entries, we've partially cracked his system. He brought up a chart showing decoded messages. 3 days ago, the conductor sent messages referencing Harvest 40 and Route Zulu. Based on the pattern, Harvest 40 likely means a 40-victim operation, and Route Zulu is a transportation route. Kestrel raised her hand. Have we identified what Route Zulu is? Agent Torres shook his head. Not yet. We know it's somewhere in the Four Corners region, but the conductor's code doesn't include precise coordinates. He expects his operatives to know the locations based on prior planning meetings. Agent Marsh stepped back in, which is where local knowledge becomes critical. Officer at CD, you mentioned Cedar Mesa as a potential location. Walk us through your thinking. Kestrel stood and approached the map. Cedar Mesa offers what traffickers need: remoteness, multiple access routes, proximity to Highway 95 and 261. If I wanted to stage a large operation with multiple vehicles and victims, I'd use this area. She traced roads on the map with her finger. There are old mining roads and ranch trails throughout the mesa, mostly unmaintained, barely used anymore. Someone could set up a temporary staging area here, bring in victims from multiple directions, consolidate them, then move them out on Highway 95 either east toward Colorado or west toward Interstate 15. From there, they could go anywhere. Agent Marsh studied the map. It fits. Torres, check if any of the conductor's coded messages reference geographical features that match Cedar Mesa. Agent Torres worked his laptop for several minutes. Got something. Message from 2 days ago. Confirm Alpha site, stone markers visible, water access. Cedar Mesa has ancient stone markers, archaeological sites with rock cairns and structures. Corbin spoke up. If they're using those sites for navigation, they're banking on them being in remote enough areas that nobody will spot the activity. But those sites are also monitored by land management agencies. We could check with BLM, see if they've reported any unusual activity. Agent Marsh assigned that task to one of the deputies. She then turned to the larger group. We're going to divide into surveillance teams and recon teams. Surveillance teams will monitor known associates of our arrested suspects, looking for any contacts with the conductor. Recon teams will scout potential operations sites, starting with Cedar Mesa. Officer at CD, you'll lead one of the recon teams. Kestrel felt a surge of both pride and pressure. This was a huge responsibility. Agent Marsh continued. Recon teams go in quietly, gather intelligence. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. If you find evidence of the operation, you report and we coordinate a response. Clear? Everyone acknowledged. The briefing continued for another hour, assigning resources, establishing communication protocols, setting up command structure. By 10 o'clock, the teams were ready to deploy. Kestrel was paired with Agent Torres and 2 tribal police officers she knew, Officer Darren Nez and Officer Rowan Chi from a different district who'd been brought in for the operation. They loaded into 2 unmarked vehicles and headed toward Cedar Mesa. The drive took 90 minutes, winding through increasingly remote terrain. Red rock formations dominated the landscape, ancient stone shaped by millions of years of erosion. They passed through the tiny community of Bluff, then turned onto Highway 95 heading west. The road climbed gradually onto the mesa, offering stunning views of the surrounding canyons. Agent Torres kept checking his tablet, monitoring signals and communications. We're in a coverage dead zone now. Cell service is spotty. Radio will be our primary communication. They turned onto a dirt road marked by a weathered BLM sign. The road deteriorated quickly, becoming little more than 2 ruts through sagebrush. Kestrel drove carefully, mindful of the rough terrain. After 3 miles, they reached a junction where multiple trails intersected. Agent Torres consulted his GPS and the suspect's map. If they're using this area, they'd want a location with visibility, somewhere they could see approaching vehicles, and they'd want multiple escape routes. Kestrel scanned the terrain. To the north, a low mesa rose about 200 feet, with what looked like an old ranch road winding up to the top. There, high ground, good sight lines, and I count at least 3 trails leading away from it. They parked and proceeded on foot, climbing the mesa carefully. The ranch road was overgrown, but still passable by 4-wheel drive vehicles. Halfway up, Rowan found fresh tire tracks pressed into a patch of sandy soil. Multiple vehicles had come through recently, within the last few days. The tracks led upward, toward the mesa top. Kestrel signaled for everyone to slow down, to approach with caution. They spread out, using the terrain for cover, moving quietly. At the top of the mesa, the ranch road opened into a flat area about the size of a football field, ringed by juniper trees and rock outcroppings. And it wasn't empty. There were vehicles parked there, 3 large vans and a box truck, all arranged in a loose circle. Near the vehicles were supplies, water containers, fuel cans, folding tables with food and equipment, and people. Kestrel counted 8 men moving around the camp, setting up what looked like temporary shelters. But no victims were visible. This was a staging area being prepared, not yet operational. Kestrel, Torres, and the others pulled back below the mesa rim and held a quick conference. "This is it," Torres whispered. "This has to be the conductor's operation site, but where are the victims?" Darren pointed back down the trail. "If they're bringing in 40 people, they wouldn't keep them all in one place until the last minute. Too risky, too difficult to manage. They're probably being held at multiple smaller locations, then brought here for consolidation and transport." Kestrel agreed. "We need to report this and get support in place, but we also need to find where the victims are being held." Agent Torres radioed the information to Agent Marsh, speaking quietly and using code phrases. The response came back within minutes. "Good work. Hold position and maintain observation. Tactical teams are being assembled. ETA 3 hours. Do not let them see you." 3 hours of watching. Kestrel settled into a concealed position behind a rock formation where she could observe the camp without being seen. The men continued their preparations, erecting canopy tents, testing equipment, checking maps. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Around noon, a pickup truck arrived, kicking up dust as it climbed the mesa. A man got out, Caucasian, maybe 55, wearing expensive outdoor clothing. He walked with authority, and the other men immediately gathered around him. Even from a distance, Kestrel could see the scar on his left hand when he gestured. The conductor, they'd found him. Agent Torres filmed everything on a small digital camera with a telephoto lens. The conductor was giving instructions, pointing to the vehicles to the trails, checking his watch repeatedly. He was animated, clearly under pressure. Something was making him nervous. After about 20 minutes, he got back in his pickup and drove away, heading down a different trail than he'd come up. Kestrel memorized the vehicle. Silver Dodge Ram, extended cab, Arizona plates. The FBI would be able to track him now, but letting him drive away felt wrong. What if he didn't come back? What if they'd just lost their primary target? Agent Torres must have read her expression. We have to play this smart. If we move on him now, we tip off the rest of the network. We let him go, track him from a distance, and when we're ready, we take down the entire operation at once. Kestrel knew he was right, but it still felt like letting a monster slip away. She watched the dust cloud from the conductor's truck fade into the distance, then returned her attention to the camp. The remaining men continued their preparations. At 14 Aquai, 2 more vehicles arrived, another van and a sedan. More men got out, bringing additional supplies. The operation was expanding. At 15:30, Agent Marsh's voice came over the radio. All teams, tactical units are in position. We have aerial surveillance overhead and roadblocks established on all major routes out of the area. Recon teams, prepare to guide tactical units to target location. Kestrel acknowledged and radioed back precise coordinates. Within 20 minutes, she could hear the distant sound of vehicles approaching. The men in the camp heard it too. They stopped what they were doing, looking towards the trails nervously. One of them pulled out a radio and started speaking urgently into it. Then, tactical vehicles appeared on multiple trails simultaneously, closing in from 3 directions. FBI SWAT teams in full gear emerged, weapons raised, loudspeakers booming. FBI, you are surrounded. Get on the ground now, hands where we can see them. The men in the camp froze, then some raised their hands while others tried to run. But there was nowhere to go. Within minutes, all 8 men were on the ground in handcuffs. Kestrel and her team moved in, weapons drawn, securing the area. Agent Marsh arrived in one of the tactical vehicles, surveying the captured camp with satisfaction. Outstanding work. Now let's find out where they're keeping the victims. The suspects were separated and interrogated. Most refused to talk, but one, a younger man who looked terrified, broke quickly when Agent Marsh explained he was facing federal trafficking charges with a mandatory 20-year minimum sentence. "I'll tell you whatever you want," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't want to go to prison for 20 years. I just needed the money." Agent Marsh showed no sympathy. "Where are the victims being held?" The young man described 3 locations: a barn about 10 miles south, an abandoned ranch house 15 miles west, and a slot canyon 8 miles east. Each location held between 10 and 15 people. Agent Marsh immediately dispatched teams to all 3 locations. Kestrel went with the team heading to the slot canyon. They drove fast, lights flashing but no sirens, not wanting to alert the guards. The canyon was accessed via a narrow 4-wheel drive trail that wound through broken terrain. As they approached, Kestrel could see why it had been chosen. The canyon entrance was nearly invisible until you were right on top of it, hidden by rock formations and vegetation. 2 men stood guard at the entrance, smoking cigarettes and looking bored. They didn't notice the approaching vehicles until it was too late. "FBI, hands up, don't move." The guards tried to run but were tackled and cuffed within seconds. Inside the canyon, federal agents found 14 people, men and women ranging from late teens to early 30s, restrained and huddled together in a natural alcove. They were dirty, dehydrated, and terrified, but alive. Medical teams moved in immediately, providing water and basic care. Kestrel helped cut the restraints off a young woman who couldn't stop crying. "You're safe now," Kestrel said softly. "It's over. You're safe." The woman clutched Kestrel's hand, unable to speak. Just holding on like Kestrel was the only solid thing in a world that had gone mad. Reports came in from the other locations. The barn yielded 12 victims and 3 more suspects arrested. The ranch house had 11 victims and 2 suspects. In total, 37 people recovered, 37 lives saved. Close to the 40 the conductor had planned for, but not quite. Agent Marsh stood in the canyon entrance coordinating the response, and her expression was grim. "We're missing people. The count doesn't match the intelligence we had. There should be 40 victims. We've only found 37. She questioned the suspects, but none would say where the other 3 were. Either they genuinely didn't know, or they were more afraid of the conductor than they were of federal prison. The tactical team secured the Mesa camp and began processing it as a crime scene. They found a treasure trove of evidence: computers, phones, documents, maps with more marked locations. And in the conductor's pickup truck, which had been tracked and intercepted about 20 miles away, they found his personal laptop. The laptop was encrypted, but the FBI's tech team was confident they could break it. The conductor himself, identified through fingerprints as a man named Coulter Hale, 54, with prior convictions for fraud and assault, was being held in federal custody, high-risk detainee status, no bail. By evening, the operation was winding down. The victims had been transported to medical facilities for evaluation and treatment. The suspects were in custody, facing a litany of federal and state charges. The evidence was being cataloged and processed. Agent Marsh called the task force together for a debrief. Today was a significant victory. We dismantled a major trafficking network, rescued 37 victims, and arrested the organization's leader. But this isn't over. Coulter Hale didn't work alone. He had connections, suppliers, buyers. We need to identify everyone involved and take down the entire chain. Kestrel sat in the debrief, feeling exhausted but wired. They'd accomplished something huge today, but Agent Marsh was right. It wasn't over. 3 victims were still missing, and somewhere out there other trafficking networks were still operating, still hunting, still destroying lives. The work was never done. After the debrief, Kestrel walked outside into the cool evening air. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. It was beautiful, this land, and it was being used as a hunting ground by predators. She thought about all the victims they'd found today, the terror in their eyes, the relief when they realized they were being rescued. Her phone rang. It was Corbin. "Kestrel, FBI wants you to stay attached to this investigation. Agent Marsh has specifically requested you. They're going to be working this case for months, tracking down every connection, finding every victim. You interested?" Kestrel didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely yes. Because what choice did she have? Those 3 missing people needed to be found, and the networks that fed people into trafficking systems needed to be destroyed. If she could help do that, if she could save even one more person, it was worth any amount of time and effort. That night, back at her apartment, Kestrel couldn't sleep again. She kept seeing the faces of the victims, kept hearing their voices. The young woman in the canyon who'd clutched her hand, the man at the barn who'd asked if his family had been notified, if they knew he was alive. The teenager at the ranch house who'd been so drugged she couldn't walk without assistance. They were the lucky ones. They'd been found. But how many others hadn't been? How many were still out there, in other canyons, other camps, waiting for rescue that might never come? She pulled up the suspect's laptop images that had been shared with the task force. The FBI's tech team had managed to crack the encryption faster than expected, and what they'd found was disturbing. Coulter Hale had been running this network for over 3 years, not 6 months. The notebook they'd found only covered recent operations. His laptop contained records going back much further. Hundreds of victims, dozens of operations, a sprawling criminal enterprise that generated millions of dollars. The scale of it was overwhelming, but there was something else in the laptop files that caught Kestrel's attention. A folder labeled Special Orders contained information about specific victims who'd been requested by buyers. Photos, physical descriptions, personal information. and 3 names that had been marked as in progress with dates from last week. 3 people who matched the count of missing victims. Kestrel zoomed in on the details. The 3 were being held separately from the main operation, at a location Coulter referred to as insurance. If the main operation was compromised, these 3 were his backup plan, his way to recover financially. She immediately called Agent Marsh, not caring that it was nearly midnight. "Agent Marsh, I found something in Coulter's laptop files. 3 victims being held at a separate location he called insurance. This might be our missing 3. Agent Marsh was silent for a moment. "Send me everything you've got. I'm pulling the team back in." Within an hour, the task force was reassembled. Agent Torres worked through the laptop files, looking for any clue about the insurance location. He found references to GPS coordinates, but they were incomplete, deliberately obscured. He's paranoid. Even in his own files, he didn't want to leave a clear trail. But there were other clues. References to slot access and water visible from site, and 2-hour drive from base. Agent Marsh looked at Kestrel. "You know this area better than anyone else here. Where would you hide 3 high-value hostages if you wanted to keep them completely separate from your main operation?" Kestrel studied the maps, thinking about terrain, access routes, remoteness. Somewhere nobody goes. Somewhere you could approach without being seen, but that's also hard to accidentally stumble upon. She zoomed in on an area northeast of Cedar Mesa. Here, this slot canyon system near Grand Gulch. It's extremely remote, requires technical climbing to access some areas, and it's in a wilderness study area where even BLM rangers rarely patrol. Agent Torres checked the coordinates. The partial GPS data from Coulter's files could match this area. The numbers align. Agent Marsh didn't waste time. "We go now. Full tactical team. If Coulter set up insurance as a failsafe, he might have ordered his people to eliminate the evidence if the main operation failed." The implication hung heavy in the air. Those 3 victims might already be dead. Or worse, their guards might kill them when they realized rescue teams were coming. They had to move fast and quiet. The convoy left at 0130, driving without lights once they got close to the target area. They parked 2 miles out and proceeded on foot, using night vision equipment. The terrain was brutal, broken rock and steep inclines, everything made more treacherous by darkness. Kestrel moved carefully, following Agent Torres and the tactical team leader. After 45 minutes of hiking, they reached the slot canyon entrance. It was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, cutting deep into the rock, and at the entrance, barely visible in the night vision glow, was a small camp. 1 tent, 1 vehicle, 2 men standing guard with rifles. The tactical team moved like ghosts. Within 30 seconds, both guards were on the ground, disarmed and cuffed before they could make a sound. One of them tried to shout, but a hand clamped over his mouth. "Quiet. Where are the hostages?" The guard's eyes were wide with fear. He gestured deeper into the slot canyon. The tactical team entered, Kestrel right behind them. The canyon twisted and turned, walls so narrow in places they had to move sideways. After about 50 yards, it opened into a small chamber, maybe 10 feet across, and there they were, 3 people, bound and gagged, lying on the canyon floor. Medical team members rushed forward, checking vitals, cutting restraints. All 3 were alive, dehydrated and traumatized, but alive. Kestrel helped a young man sit up, removing his gag gently. "You're safe. We're police. You're safe now." The young man's eyes filled with tears. I thought no one would find us. I thought we were going to die here." Kestrel squeezed his shoulder. "You're going to be okay. We've got you." They carefully moved the 3 victims out of the slot canyon. A slow process in the darkness with people who could barely walk. By the time they reached the vehicles and got the victims into ambulances, the sun was rising. Agent Marsh stood with Kestrel, watching the ambulances drive away. 40 victims. We found all 40. She looked exhausted, but satisfied. Because of your work, officer at CD, you broke this case open, and you didn't stop until everyone was found. Kestrel felt a wave of emotion, relief, exhaustion, pride, grief for what these people had endured. We got them back. That's what matters. Agent Marsh nodded. Yes, but we couldn't have done it without you. When this case goes to trial, I'll be recommending you for federal recognition. You've earned it. The recognition felt distant and unimportant compared to the knowledge that 40 people were safe. 40 people who would have disappeared forever into trafficking networks, reduced to commodities, their lives destroyed. Now they had a chance to recover, to rebuild, to go home. That was the real victory. As Kestrel drove back toward Montezuma Creek in the growing daylight, she thought about all the canyons and mesas she'd passed, all the remote places where terrible things could happen unseen. The landscape was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. It could hide horrors or reveal them, depending on who was looking and how carefully they searched. The weeks following the operation blurred together. Kestrel found herself pulled between regular patrol duties and ongoing work with the FBI task force. The case against Coulter Hale and his network was massive, sprawling across multiple jurisdictions and involving hundreds of pieces of evidence. Every phone call logged, every message decoded, every victim interviewed added another layer to the prosecution's case. Kestrel testified before a grand jury twice, walking them through her investigation from that first suspicious van at Combe Ridge to the final rescue in Grand Gulch. The grand jury returned indictments on 73 individuals involved in the trafficking network at various levels. But it was the victim impact statements that stayed with Kestrel. As part of the case building, prosecutors interviewed all 40 recovered victims about their experiences. The FBI shared some of these statements with the task force, and Kestrel read them late at night in her apartment, feeling the weight of each one. Stories of being lured with false job offers, or kidnapped from parking lots or sold by people they'd trusted. Stories of being moved from location to location, always restrained, always afraid. Stories of other victims who'd been separated from them, taken to unknown destinations, never seen again. Those other victims, the ones who hadn't been recovered, haunted Kestrel. Agent Marsh called one evening with an update. Coulter's laptop has given us leads on his connections outside the Four Corners area. We've shared intelligence with FBI field offices in Nevada, California, and Texas. They're running parallel investigations into trafficking networks that may have ties to Coulter's operation. Kestrel asked the question that had been eating at her. What about the victims from earlier operations? The notebook showed over 200 people trafficked in 6 months, and his laptop goes back years. Where are they all? Agent Marsh was quiet for a moment. That's the hard part. Most of them disappear into various forms of exploitation. Forced labor, prostitution, overseas markets. Some we might be able to track and recover. Many we won't. The reality of it was crushing. They'd saved 40 people, which was significant. But it was a fraction of the total damage Coulter's network had done. And his network was just one of many operating across the country. The scope of the problem felt overwhelming. Kestrel threw herself into work, taking extra shifts, volunteering for any task force activity that came up. Corbin noticed and pulled her aside one afternoon. "You're burning out. I can see it. You need to take some time off." Kestrel shook her head. "I'm fine. There's too much work to do." Corbin's expression was firm. "That's exactly why you need a break. The work will still be here when you get back, but if you burn out now, you're no good to anyone." Reluctantly, Kestrel took a long weekend off. She drove north into Utah, into the canyon country she'd been patrolling and investigating for weeks, but this time just to see it. She hiked into some of the remote areas, places where tourists rarely ventured, and sat among the ancient rock formations listening to the wind. The land was healing in its way. It had witnessed human suffering for thousands of years, ancient peoples struggling to survive in this harsh environment, more recent conflicts and tragedies. The trafficking victims were just the latest chapter in a long history of pain, but the land endured. It would outlast all of it. On her second day off, hiking in a narrow canyon near natural bridges, Kestrel found something that stopped her cold. Carved into the canyon wall, recent and crude, were initials and a date. MR 2024. Below it, someone had scratched "Help me" in uneven letters. Kestrel's blood ran cold. She photographed the carving, noting the GPS coordinates, then immediately called Agent Marsh. "I found something. Looks like a victim's message carved into a canyon wall, recent, within the past year." Agent Marsh had her send the photos and coordinates immediately. "We'll check it against missing persons reports and victim statements. Good eye, Kestrel." The initials matched a missing person report from 8 months ago. Michael Reeves, a 19-year-old from Durango who'd vanished while hiking near Bluff. His family had been searching for him ever since, distributing flyers, organizing search parties, desperate for any information. The FBI contacted them with the news that evidence of Michael had been found, that he might have been taken by a trafficking network. The family was devastated, but grateful to finally have answers. Michael himself had not been among the victims recovered. Agent Marsh's team added him to the list of people they were trying to track through the network's records. Kestrel's weekend off ended up being cut short when Agent Torres called on Sunday morning. "We've had a break in Coulter's laptop encryption. There's a hidden partition we just accessed. It contains communication logs with buyers, people who were purchasing victims from the network. Names, locations, transaction details. This is huge." Kestrel drove back immediately and joined the task force at their temporary office. The hidden partition was a goldmine of information, but it was also deeply disturbing. Coulter had been maintaining detailed records of buyers, including their preferences for specific types of victims, amounts paid, and delivery locations. The buyers ranged from individuals to organized crime groups to corporations using forced labor. Some were in the United States, others international. The FBI's trafficking division immediately began coordinating with international law enforcement agencies. Interpol, Europol, and agencies in Asia and South America were all contacted. This wasn't just dismantling one network anymore, it was tracing connections across a global system of human exploitation. Kestrel felt small in the face of it. How could they possibly fight something so vast? But Agent Marsh had a different perspective. Every network we take down, every buyer we arrest, every victim we recover, that's progress. We can't fix everything at once, but we can make it harder for these predators to operate. We can save lives, one case at a time. 3 weeks after the final rescue, the first trial began. Federal prosecutors were starting with Coulter Hale himself, charging him with conspiracy, human trafficking, kidnapping, and organized crime violations. The trial was expected to last 2 months. Kestrel was subpoenaed to testify, and she spent days preparing with the prosecution team. They walked her through what questions would be asked, how to respond to defense tactics, how to handle the pressure of testifying in a high-profile case. When the day came, Kestrel walked into the federal courthouse in Albuquerque wearing her dress uniform, feeling the weight of 40 victims' hopes for justice on her shoulders. The courtroom was packed: media, victim advocates, families of the missing law enforcement personnel. Coulter Hale sat at the defense table in a suit, looking nothing like the man she'd seen commanding his operation on that mesa. His attorney was slick and expensive, already trying to poke holes in the prosecution's case. Kestrel was sworn in and took the stand. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Ms. Brennan, led her through her testimony methodically. The initial call about the suspicious van, the tracks leading into the canyon, the discovery of 12 victims at Comb Ridge, the map that led them to Bears Ears, the laptop that led them to Cedar Mesa, and finally Grand Gulch. Kestrel spoke clearly and calmly, sticking to the facts, avoiding emotional language. But when Ms. Brennan asked her to describe the condition of the victims when they were found, Kestrel couldn't keep the emotion entirely out of her voice. They were terrified, bound, drugged, held in conditions no human being should endure. Some thought they were going to die. Some had given up hope of ever being rescued. The defense attorney objected. Speculation, calls for emotional response. But the judge overruled it. This was direct observation from a law enforcement officer at the scene. It stood. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to suggest Kestrel had jumped to conclusions, that the suspects could have been engaged in legitimate activities that were misinterpreted. He tried to paint the victims as willing participants in illegal immigration who'd later claimed to be kidnapped to avoid deportation. Kestrel shut it down firmly. "Sir, I found people drugged and restrained in remote canyons. I found maps detailing operations to move human beings like cargo. I found records showing these people were being sold. There is no legitimate activity that looks like that." The defense attorney persisted, but Kestrel didn't waver. She'd been trained for this, and she knew the truth of what she'd seen. The trial continued for weeks. More witnesses testified. FBI agents, other victims, forensic experts analyzing the laptop data. The evidence was overwhelming. Coulter's own records condemned him. In the final week of trial, several of the rescued victims testified about their experiences. Kestrel sat in the gallery and watched them find the courage to face their abuser in court. The young woman from Comb Ridge, the first one Kestrel had found, testified about being kidnapped from a parking lot in Phoenix, transported across state lines, held in that canyon for 3 days before the rescue. She looked directly at Coulter as she spoke. "You stole my life. You tried to sell me like I was an object. But I survived, and you're going to pay for what you did." The jury deliberated for just under 2 days. When they returned with verdicts, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts. Kestrel watched Coulter's face as the verdicts were read. He showed no emotion, just stared straight ahead like he'd already accepted this outcome. Sentencing was scheduled for a month later, but everyone knew what was coming. Multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Coulter Hale would die in federal prison. As Kestrel left the courthouse that day, she was swarmed by media asking for statements. She kept it brief. Justice was served today. 40 people are safe because of the work of many dedicated law enforcement personnel. That's what matters. Back in Montezuma Creek, life slowly returned to normal. Kestrel went back to regular patrol duties, though she stayed connected to the ongoing investigations spawned by Coulter's case. More arrests were made as the FBI tracked down his associates. More trials were scheduled. The work continued, as it always would. One evening, about 2 months after Coulter's conviction, Kestrel received a call from an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Officer at CD?" The voice was familiar, the young woman from Comb Ridge. "I hope it's okay that I called. The victim services people gave me your number. I wanted to thank you again." Kestrel felt emotion rising in her throat. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job. The young woman, her name was Sarah, disagreed. "You saved my life, you and everyone else on that team. I'm in therapy now, working through everything, and my therapist said it might help to talk to you, to tell you what it meant being rescued." They talked for almost an hour. Sarah described her recovery process, the nightmares that still plagued her, but also the moments of hope and healing. She'd enrolled in community college, was reconnecting with her family, was slowly rebuilding her life. "I'm not going to let what happened define me," she said. "I'm going to be more than just a victim." After the call, Kestrel sat in her apartment feeling overwhelmed. This was why she did the job. Not for recognition or awards or promotions. For moments like this, hearing that someone she'd helped was finding their way back to life. The trauma would never completely disappear. Sarah had been through hell, but she was surviving it, fighting through it. And she wasn't alone. All 40 of the recovered victims were on various paths of recovery, some faster than others, but all moving forward. That was the real victory. That was the point of all the long hours and difficult investigations and brutal court testimony. The FBI formally closed the task force operation 6 months after the initial rescue at Comb Ridge. They'd arrested 97 individuals connected to the trafficking network across 7 states. They'd recovered an additional 23 victims who'd been trafficked through Coulter's network in previous operations. They'd provided intelligence to international agencies that led to operations in 4 other countries. The impact was significant, measurable. But Agent Marsh was clear in her final briefing. "We've won this battle, but the war continues. Trafficking networks are like weeds, cut one down and others grow. Our job is to keep cutting them down, to make it harder and harder for predators to operate, until the costs outweigh the profits." Kestrel received a commendation from the FBI director and a Medal of Valor from the Navajo Nation. The ceremonies were nice, the recognition appreciated, but what meant more was a letter she received from the family of Michael Reeves, the young man whose message she'd found carved in the canyon wall. They thanked her for not giving up, for keeping their son's case alive even though he hadn't been found yet. The FBI was still tracking leads, still trying to determine what had happened to Michael and others who remained missing. The letter ended. "Knowing that people like you are out there, fighting for those who can't fight for themselves, gives us hope. Please don't stop." Kestrel kept that letter in her locker at the station. On difficult days when the job felt overwhelming, when the darkness seemed too pervasive to fight, she'd read it and remember why she wore the badge. Spring came to the Four Corners region, bringing with it wildflowers that covered the desert floor in unexpected splashes of color. Kestrel was back on regular patrol, driving the familiar roads through Comb Ridge and Cedar Mesa, the landscapes that had been the backdrop for so much horror and so much heroism. The land looked peaceful now, serene in the morning light, giving no hint of the dramas that had played out here. She pulled over at a scenic overlook, one of her favorite spots, and got out to stretch her legs. The view stretched for miles, red rock formations, distant mesas, sky so blue it hurt to look at. This was why she'd stayed in this region, why she'd become a tribal police officer, to protect this land and the people who lived on it, to stand between predators and prey, to be the person who showed up when someone called for help. The work was hard, sometimes heartbreaking, often frustrating. But it was necessary, and she was good at it. Her radio crackled. Dispatch with a new call. "Unit 7, we have a report of a suspicious vehicle on County Road 415 near the school bus stop. Caller reports the vehicle has been parked there for several hours. Can you check it out?" Kestrel felt that familiar tingle of alertness, history echoing. She keyed her radio. 10-4, dispatch, en route. She got back in her unit and headed toward the location, mind already working through possibilities, instincts engaged. It was probably nothing, a broken-down vehicle, a lost tourist. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something that needed attention, something that needed to be stopped before it grew into something worse. As she drove, Kestrel thought about all the victims she'd helped rescue. Sarah, rebuilding her life in community college. The young man from the barn who'd reunited with his family. The teenager from the ranch house who was in intensive therapy but making progress. All of them alive because someone had made a call about a suspicious vehicle, because an officer had responded and followed her instincts, because people had worked together to do what was right. That chain of small actions leading to major results. That was how you fought evil, not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations necessarily, but with consistent determined effort. With showing up every day, ready to do the job. The suspicious vehicle turned out to be exactly what it appeared. A broken-down sedan belonging to a family from Colorado whose car had died while they were sightseeing. Kestrel helped them contact a tow truck and gave them a ride to the nearest gas station to wait. The family thanked her profusely, the kids excited about riding in a police car. It was routine, uneventful, the kind of call that made up 90% of police work. But Kestrel didn't mind, because you never knew which call would turn into something more. You never knew which suspicious vehicle would be the one that mattered. As evening approached and her shift ended, Kestrel drove back to the station. She filed her reports, secured her equipment, and changed out of her uniform. In the parking lot, she ran into Corbin, who was just starting a night shift. "How was your day?" he asked. Kestrel smiled. "Quiet. Just the way I like it." Corbin laughed. "After the past few months, we've earned some quiet." They chatted for a few minutes about department business, upcoming training, routine matters. Before he headed inside, Corbin said, "You did good work on that trafficking case. Really good. The whole department's proud of you." Kestrel felt warmth at the praise. We all did good work. It was a team effort. Driving home, Kestrel thought about what came next. The FBI had hinted they might want to bring her in as a liaison for future trafficking investigations in the region. The tribal police were considering creating a specialized unit focused on organized crime and trafficking. There were possibilities opening up, opportunities to make a bigger impact. But there was also value in regular patrol work, in being visible in the community, in responding to calls both routine and critical. She didn't have to decide immediately. For now, she was content to do her job, to show up every day ready to help whoever needed it. At home, Kestrel made dinner and settled on her couch with a book, trying to relax. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Marsh. "Michael Reeves has been located. Alive. Being brought home. Wanted you to know." Kestrel stared at the message, reading it 3 times to make sure she understood. Michael was alive. After 8 months missing, after being trafficked through Coulter's network, after his message carved desperately in a canyon wall, he'd been found. Agent Marsh sent a follow-up. He was located in California, forced labor situation. Details to follow, but he's coming home. Kestrel felt tears on her face and didn't try to stop them. Another life saved, another family reunited, another small victory in an endless war. But these small victories added up. They mattered. They were the whole point. Kestrel typed back, "Thank you for letting me know. That's the best news I've heard all year." Because it was. Everything she'd been through. The long hours, the difficult cases, the nightmares about victims she couldn't save. It was worth it for moments like this. For knowing that someone like Michael was going home, that his family's hope had been justified, that the message carved in stone had been seen and answered. She went to bed that night feeling something close to peace. The work would continue tomorrow. There would be more calls, more investigations, more people needing help. The trafficking networks would keep operating, keep hunting, keep trying to exploit the vulnerable. But there would also be people like her, like Agent Marsh, like Corbin and all the other officers and agents who showed up every day to fight back. And sometimes, often enough to matter, they would win. They would rescue the victims, arrest the predators, bring people home. It wasn't perfect justice. The system had too many flaws, too many gaps. But it was better than nothing. It was the light pushed against the darkness. Weeks later, Kestrel attended a ceremony honoring the task force that had taken down Coulter Hale's network. All 40 rescued victims had been invited, and about half attended, those who felt ready to face the public recognition. Sarah was there, looking stronger than when Kestrel had first found her, no longer the terrified young woman drugged and bound in a canyon. She'd become an advocate, speaking publicly about trafficking and working with victim services organizations. When she saw Kestrel, she crossed the room and hugged her tightly. "Thank you. Thank you for everything." Kestrel hugged her back. "You did the hard part. You survived. You rebuilt. That takes real courage." The ceremony included speeches from FBI officials, tribal police leadership, and representatives from victim advocacy groups. They talked about the importance of the work, the difference it made, the lives that had been saved. They presented awards and commendations, but the most powerful moment came when one of the victims, a young man named David, stood up to speak. He'd been trafficked for forced labor, held in conditions of modern slavery for 5 months before being rescued from that barn near Cedar Mesa. His voice shook as he spoke. "I thought I was going to die there. I thought nobody knew where I was, that nobody cared. But you did. You found me. You brought me home. And now I get to live my life. That's a gift I can never repay." Kestrel stood in the back of the room, listening, and felt the weight of responsibility that came with wearing a badge. People depended on officers to show up, to care, to do the hard work of protecting the vulnerable. It was a responsibility she didn't take lightly. As the ceremony ended and people mingled, several victims approached Kestrel to thank her personally. Each conversation was brief, just a handshake or hug, a few words of gratitude. But collectively they reinforced why she'd chosen this career. These were real people whose lives had been shattered and were now being pieced back together. And she'd played a part in that recovery. That was a privilege. On the drive back to Montezuma Creek, Kestrel stopped at that same overlook where she'd paused before responding to the call about the suspicious vehicle weeks earlier. The sun was setting now, painting the landscape in golds and purples. The ancient stone formations stood as they had for millions of years, indifferent to human drama, beautiful and eternal. She stood there for a long time, just breathing the cool evening air, feeling connected to this land and the people who called it home. The radio on her belt was quiet, the shift over, but tomorrow would bring new calls, new challenges, new opportunities to help. She thought about all the canyons out there, all the remote places where terrible things could happen, but also all the officers patrolling, all the investigators working cases, all the people watching out for their neighbors. A network of protection, not perfect, but persistent, and sometimes, when everything aligned just right, when someone noticed something wrong and called it in, when an officer responded and followed through, when teams worked together and didn't give up, sometimes they could stop evil before it destroyed more lives. Sometimes they could bring people home. That was enough. That had to be enough, because the alternative was giving up, letting the darkness win, accepting that some people were disposable, and Kestrel would never accept that. Not while she wore the badge, not while she drew breath. There would always be predators, always be victims, always be injustice. But there would also always be people willing to fight back, to stand in the gap, to be the light in the darkness. Kestrel was one of those people, and tomorrow she'd be back on patrol, ready to answer the call, ready to do whatever was needed to protect the vulnerable and stop the predators. That was her job, that was her purpose, and she wouldn't have it any other way.